Hi, Nikhil. Good to see you.
Hi, hi. Sorry, one sec. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for day two of PrivacyNama. I'm just wondering, can everyone see me? Okay. So, we're exploring the intersection of AI, data, and data protection. And like I said yesterday, the theme may not be surprising to you, but what's surprising to us is that we really haven't had this conversation in India. And there seems to be a bit of a not just inaction, but a lack of intent in moving forward with figuring out how AI impacts data protection. So much of the discussion is focused on liability and some of it on intellectual property, but a lot of it is focused on the type of approach, a risk-based approach or a harms-based approach, and reducing any kind of overheads, because there are a few tensions that we are seeing especially when it comes to AI. So one tension that we saw yesterday play out was between legitimate use of data uh, and and consent. Um, Almost as if companies can use the legitimate interest part of data protection or the for usage of data in order to override consent. And there's a uh, uh, how especially for fraud prevention, but also in a sense for scraping data or hoovering up data for because economic development and is key. There's also a significant tension between the need for countries to emerge as leaders or jurisdictions to emerge as leaders in AI, and what's happening in Europe with some models not being launched is almost being seen as an example of what not to do in terms of enforcement of rights, because AI effectively and it's has violated um, rights. And that's also linked to another question to which we haven't received an answer yet, which is about mixed data sets, which mix both personal data and non-personal data. And clearly, there were laws that were already active when these models have been trained and rolled out to the public. But and effectively, therefore, uh, privacy rights may have been violated. But there's also this lack of intent in some cases to enforce them because of economic consequences and because these services may not be available in a jurisdiction or a country, but also because they don't want to hinder the development of local AI. Another thing that we noticed was that its enforcement capacity uh, is being seen as a restriction on rights, in a sense that regulators are not acting because they don't have the capacity. And lack of capacity is a reason for delayed action or inaction. Um, and from a privacy in the global south perspective, there is a significant need to develop LLMs for local languages, and the need for data for local context for local languages also being seen as essential. So it's almost as if privacy and data protection, in the way many people are looking at it, both from countries as well as from a civil society perspective, it looks like privacy is perhaps being sacrificed at the altar of the need for technological development and the need for economic growth, because no one wants to be left out in this race of the fourth industrial revolution. So that makes for an interesting set of conversations today. Uh, our first discussion is with representatives of data protection uh, authorities on how they view some of these challenges. We then have a conversation on AI and sovereignty, both from the perspective of developing sovereign AI solutions, but also restrictions on data flows in order to empower the creation of local AI. And the last session is on an old topic that we've explored before, but now with a clearer context on the need for massive amounts of data, including non-personal data for the AI, and then what that does for the economic rights as well, but also what it does uh, for personal privacy rights. So I'll hand over to Malvika Raghavan to take this forward. And thank you all for joining us today. Malvika.
Thanks so much, Nikhil, for that introduction. And thanks everyone for being here at 2 p.m. on a Friday. I think this is the real data protection enthusiasts section. I'm really delighted to be joined by two esteemed panelists, Mr. Fernando and Marcus Wunchelbaum from Germany, Mr. Fernando from Sri Lanka, both kind of ICT legal pioneers. I know, Mr. Fernando, you've been deeply involved with writing Sri Lanka's data protection law, the first South Asian data protection law. And I know, Marcus, from our previous conversation, that you're actually involved with enforcing data protection and really thinking through the AI Act in the EU and how that affects data protection authorities. So my comments will be very brief. And then really, I think the invitation is to try and help us understand when India is at such a nascent state, how to really think about data protection when it faces this new challenge of AI that we've all been hearing so much about. I guess before we jump in, I just want to pick up on a couple of things Nikhil said. These things matter deeply in our data fight state, especially in India. We've had live cases about content moderation decisions and social networks. The distribution of our social benefits is highly automated, and there is talk of that data being used for credit scoring and offering of loans to welfare beneficiaries. And much of this is run on state-run infrastructure. We have algorithmic management of platform workers, you name it. So AI is already running a lot of our processes, and this is beyond just your standard content recommendations on Amazon. And lately, I think a lot of the chat has really become about generative AI models and large language models and OpenAI and so on. But I think we forget that there's more basic points at which AI is driving. It's not just about open ChatGPT. I'm sure a lot of our conversation will be, but we are currently seeing AI-based weapons of war, right? Playing a large role in targeting and identifying or misidentifying targets in live theaters of war. So I think really my intent with this session is to ask you for your thoughts, and later when we have audience questions in the last half an hour, to really try and bring it back to why does this matter now and why does it matter for data protection. And so I think hopefully we can start off from that and really think about, I think the first question that I wanted to invite both the panelists to say, why do we need to think about AI? Because if we start with the data protection perspective, data protection law already provides for the need for a lawful basis to touch people's data, the rights for data subjects, and also the need for transparency and accountability and so on. So in one sense, you could say, okay, now a computer is processing data, but even if a human processed data, we had some rights and obligations. So my first question, and I invite maybe Mr. Fernando to begin and then Marcus to take us forward, and just to get your thoughts on what do you think is the intersection of the role of a data protection law when it comes to AI, and why do we need anything more than a data protection law to regulate machine-based data processing? So over to you, Mr. Fernando, if I can invite you first.
Thank you very much, Malvika. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much to Nikhil and all of you for organizing this very important session, a session of significant importance from a national as well as international perspective. I don't perceive to be expert, although you introduced us as experts. I would always call us students of law or students of AI, because this subject is evolving so rapidly that we all need to learn from each other to figure out how to optimize support for innovation and growth, whilst looking at the right balance to strike in terms of legislative regulatory intervention. It's always difficult to get that right balance. in any regulatory perspective. In the introduction, Nikhil quite rightly mentioned about the evolution of data protection as an important subject and the various mechanisms it may have in relation to protecting personal data and how that can or the regulatory framework governing data privacy can have an impact on AI innovation and growth. Now, from a Sri Lankan perspective, I just want to highlight a couple of things before I go on to talk a little bit about our national AI strategy. From a Sri Lankan perspective, at the time the law was drafted, we made it a transparent, open process. So much so that unlike some of our other laws, which are drafted in closed door, we made sure every single version was published online. As a result, we got a glimpse of what the local experts and what their issues and challenges were. We also got perspectives from international experts, even especially those even from India and in the region, about the challenges they were facing with regulatory instruments like what we were drafting. So, in the very preamble to the legislation, and to remind a future regulator about how to strike the right balance, we carved in a couple of principles in the preamble itself, uh, stating clearly that this was a law to facilitate growth and innovation in the digital economy, whilst ensuring the protection of personal data uh, in relation to data subjects and their rights. So keep in mind, although the law is about regulating processing of personal data, we have carved in these principles at the very outset. And the second aspect is to create a regulatory framework that will necessarily help improve interoperability between data protection frameworks and strengthen cross-border cooperation. We included that substance so that a future regulator will not work in isolation, but will draw from the best practices available in other countries and engage in a cooperative effort to create a regulatory system which is interoperable. And why was interoperable needed? Regulatory statutes such as data protection, data privacy, or whatever you may call it, may have an inhibition or may have concerns with regard to supporting or inhibiting growth and development. And this becomes the case mainly in relation to new and novel products associated with AI, where you may often have a mixed bag of data. And I think this was highlighted by Nikhil, where you may have personal data connected with whole lot of non-personal data. And this we see in some of the analytics done in relation to farmer cultivation and mapping around the land availability and land utilization by the farming community in Sri Lanka. A recent technology innovation that was used by the Department of Agriculture that helps them to figure out the requirements for fertilizer and the outputs coming from the various paddy cultivators. But the problem in that kind of a technology innovation and AI-driven model is that the entire fields of GPS data connecting the various blocks of land where cultivation is happening, those are linked to farmers. So you have farmer identity, which is protected by personal data linked to all sets of data which are non-personal. So how do you segregate and how do you create an arrangement where data protection privacy can step in to whilst ensuring protection of personal data relating to farmers and to ensure that their financial data or the fertilizer subsidy, etc., is properly protected. There is also the element of transparency with regard to utilization of subsidy and the usage of the land and how that data can feed into a national ecosystem that can support that subsidy, support that community more effectively, right? So keeping that in mind, our regulatory framework, as Nikhil, he was in Sri Lanka with us last November when we launched a policy paper on cross-border data flows in Sri Lanka. He made a fantastic pitch and we learned a lot from his perspectives as well. What I want to emphasize is that while we managed to draw a lot of best practices, including from OECD privacy principles, including principles from GDPR and APEC privacy framework, and created a hybrid legal framework for the Sri Lankan data protection law. We created a different enforcement model. And I just want to conclude you with two thoughts, which I will highlight later. One aspect we addressed or tried to address is this supporting innovation and growth in the technology era and supporting AI so that in a way, so that when it comes to data subjects' rights, such as right to erase, right to rectify, right to modify, we created a model where one does not create unilateral rights data subjects, but balance it in such a way where those who are regulated, namely controllers and processors, have the ability to refuse a request on certain criteria as specified under Section 17 of our PDPA. And most notably, I just want to flesh out one simple line in that section, which is of value, where the controller is not having the technical or operational feasibility to agree to a request and therefore refuses the request. And of course, we have a right of appeal created, and the future data protection regulator can evaluate that based on a situation where there's a mixed bag, like in the example I gave, or in a situation where a blockchain or any other technology is used, where it's really impossible to erase, right? You have multiple replicates, and how to best manage technology innovation in this kind of an ecosystem. And of course, later on, I will explain a very specific provision relating to ADM, automated decision making, and how we are approaching that subject. So I hope I may have already taken too much of your time, and I will give you back the floor. Thank you.
Not at all. Actually, I was just going to say before inviting Marcus to the conversation that I think what these comments, the opening comments, have really well framed that for those of us who don't, those countries that have a data protection law, that will be necessarily the starting point for regulating AI, right? And that's really interesting. You've already touched on 3 or 4 things that I hope we'll go into in this session. One is that big role of mixed data sets. This was already in the background in the non-personal data conversation where at least in India, the idea was that if you keep personal data protections aside, we can create a registry for sharing non-personal data sets. How does that change when you have AI training on that kind of data, if at all it's possible, which I personally, I'm not even sure it is. As you mentioned, between how do you separate a farmer from the GPS coordinates of their land in a data record, right? I think that was really interesting. I think what really came through was the role of the state in these large models and in also holding the data especially in developmental contexts where you have things like, farmer subsidies and fertilizer subsidies. I think potentially one of the three largest subsidies that the Indian government gives out. And all of that data sits on Indian government servers and data sets. And then, of course, I think this big question of enforcement. I think we probably need a separate section for that, because one is the principles, but de facto, I think data protection regulators are going to be the first one facing the AI regulation, whether we like it or not. However, we're going straight to another context where this is not the case, right? In the EU, you so advanced, you have two laws. You have the AI Act and you have the GDPR, the gold standard. We're waiting to see if the Brussels effect will happen with the EU AI Act as well. And you have only, what is it, since we started talking, maybe less than an hour to tell us everything we need to know about it. But with that, Ashley, I suppose just to reframe the original question I asked is, why did EU feel the need for a separate legislation, given that so many of these issues are pre-existing data protection issues? I mean, we had them anyway. It's just I think AI has made them more salient because of the power and the reach of the data sets that we get with AI. So over to you, Marcus, and thank you again for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for providing this really unique and interesting perspective, because one can say that in Europe, we often sit in this ivory tower. We have all these laws and we're trying to figure out how to interpret them, but we never even think about, because we're such a such a regulatory happy kind of union, we never think about like a state where we do not have regulation. We only deal with the regulation we have, which is a blessing and a curse. Let's put it this way. But I think why to your question, and it's a really good question, to why we even need something like the AI Act, for example. I can answer this question concerning the AI Act, because it's difficult for me now to say, well, do we need any AI regulation if I have something in front of me? So what's the difference between the AI Act and the GDPR? There is a major difference, and I think it does regulate something that wasn't regulated before, because the AI Act is a product regulation. It regulates systems, it regulates models, it regulates the value chain. So it regulates development, testing, market placing, and then deployment. This is very different from the GDPR, which regulates all of those things, but doesn't name them. It names them data processing. And so the main difference is the perspective. So GDPR is data subject orientated. And what we talked about just now with Mr. Fernando, we could see that it was mainly about how do data subjects enforce their rights? How does the government help to enforce data subject rights? The AI Act does not care as much about the subject or the data subject, because it's about a new economic field, a new economic sector, and it regulates how this new technology is going to be introduced. And it does so with a system that reminds us, in Europe at least, of the way how children's toys are regulated or produce is regulated. It needs to be safe. And they started regulating AI. I mean, the talks and the trilogues were starting before OpenAI happened. The law was amended because of it, obviously, because then people were like, oh, this actually happens in practice. Interesting. But they had this product regulation approach before. And so that is the main difference, sort of, that you have an economic process that you're trying to regulate, that you are trying to regulate how AI is developed. And it's not about the data processing. It's not really about the data subject. It is about humans, but on a grand scale. Like, how does this risk human lives, safety, and health? It's not about, oh, can one single subject get their data access now or no? It's more global, honestly. And if you read the AI Act, it kind of shows you where the GDPR might also be lacking, because the GDPR does not have a product-oriented approach. And in our pre-interview, I told you this before, if we as a data protection authority want to be active and, for example, regulate, we can regulate data processing, one single data processing. We cannot regulate a software. We cannot regulate a product. We cannot regulate developing in that grand sense. We can say, do not do this specific type of processing, which in the grand scheme of like a whole technology is not enough. Because then you can't say this product does not meet our standards, please, or no, do not sell it. That's it. It's off the market. We are not able to do that with data privacy. We can say, do not do this, do not do that. And in the end, maybe there might be a data processing that is so vital to a product that we eventually ban the product by banning the data processing. But that has not happened yet. And the AI Act has a more direct approach in that sense. And so just by that approach, I think it already proves what it can do. And the GDPR is in that sense more broad. It's one size fits all. It's data subject orientated, but what the AI Act now does to us as data protection authorities is that we learn from this product orientated approach. Data privacy in that way becomes more precise. In a world before the AI Act, we might have not differentiated between an AI system and an AI model. We would have just said AI. Somewhere there must be personal data processing. That's it. We will regulate this. And now, I mean, data protection has always been technical, but maybe not technical enough. And now we're becoming more precise. We know now that there's GDPR or Sonnet 3.5, and that is not the same thing as ChatGPT or Claude. And for us in Hamburg, for example, for the guidances that we give, the discussions that we have in Hamburg and in Europe, that is a major issue because we are discussing right now, for example, coming to your question of like mixed data sets, if there's a difference between the model and the system in a way where you could argue that the model does not store personal data. The training is personal data. The system operating is processing personal data. The input is personal data. The output is personal data. But is a model that is just lying there, does that really contain personal data, or is that more of an abstract kind of information that was drawn from the training data? This is a really controversial discussion that we are having right now in Hamburg, in Europe, in Germany, and the European Data Protection Board is also dealing with this. So this is where we are right now, that the AI Act is sort of propelling data protection in a way where you also said that we have to enforce on the one hand, but also we have to become better. We have to become more precise. And I think in that sense, GDPR regulation might now become less flat rate, less one size fits all, more specific, more risk orientated because of the AI Act and what it teaches us. And I think in that sense, that is maybe also one of the major differences to other countries that do not have like such a big regulatory body of laws, because we have a more established regulatory framework. It's young. The gold standard is like 6 years old. It's not that old. So, but what we need to do is now figure out how we use it, because the wording is broad. And I think that is one of the major differences that we're going to have in the future. So question to your answer is, yes, we needed the AI Act because it has a new approach. I don't think that the GDPR would need an AI amendment in that sense, but it needs to be reinterpreted in a way where it fits AI regulation, AI tech, AI systems and AI models better. And we are doing that right now. So yeah, I think that is the answer to your question.
No, thank you so much, Marcus. And I think at a very high level, I think that really frames this kind of product liability approach that EU has taken. And because we do live in the software startup world, I'm sure a lot of the audience members come from that world. You think in terms of products. It's only lawyers who think, that data is walking around with a little tag which says I am personal data and I am non-personal data. It's you live in a product world, and data is almost, someone once told me, I hate analogies. They said it's more like a river than having pieces of pie, but keeping that to one side. I guess I just had a quick follow-up question is how do you deal with that in the context of digital technologies, right? Because digitality, from the academic side, I know Mireille Hildebrand is somebody who's written a lot about the multi-stability of digital objects, right? The idea that digital products can be used in different contexts and they evolve through use. And so how do you, I mean, does the EU AI deal with that? The fact that a product such as ChatGPT or OpenAI's version, but other LLMs, they can be used to do multiple applications, right? So how does it deal with that? In a sense, we've always thought of product liability as being, I go and buy a bottle of aerated beverage. There's a snail in the beverage. I can sue the company that made the Coke or the Pepsi or whatever it is. In this context, the product itself goes across from health to social security to what have you. How do you tackle that?
So in the GDPR sense, that doesn't make any difference because data processing is data processing is data processing. And the question then will remain like, okay, what are your legal grounds? Do you have sensible personal pieces of personal data? Then we have a more strict regulation. But in that sense, the GDPR is one size fits all and doesn't discriminate against any particular use in that sense. And because of that, it doesn't ban a particular kind of use. It says if you do not have a legal ground, you may not process data, but it does not say for this specific setting, you may not process data. Like social scoring, what you mentioned, for example, is not something that the GDPR would ban outright. The data processing would be banned if there wouldn't be a legal ground or the legal ground wouldn't be adequate because of fundamental rights protection, but the GDPR doesn't ban it outright. The AI Act does. The AI Act has because of that issue that you can use products in multiple ways. The AI Act has a two-prong kind of approach. On the one hand, it says that there are certain AI practices. That's the wording it uses, practices, not products, but practices that are outright banned. And those are mainly subliminal techniques to influence human decision-making, social scoring, and these kind of things where you mainly have the government influencing human beings. That's kind of the main thing that the AI Act wanted to ban outright. Biometric identification systems were supposed to be banned, but some governments in Europe are really interested in having those. So we have an interesting situation there where it is banned, but there are exceptions. If a member state decides to choose one of those exceptions and make it work. So that's one approach, basically, in the Act to say some practices are banned outright. Now, that would also consider, for example, a generative AI system such as ChatGPT. If you use it for that kind of approach and you sell it for that purpose or you put it into service, then it's banned. On the other hand, we have high-risk services that are allowed, explicitly so, but there are very high compliance demands attached to them. So, for example, you would have certain sectors. Basically, we say we have certain sectors where certain uses for AI products are also high risk. And if a Gen AI product is used in that way, then you become a high risk system. So you may, for example, as a provider or a deployer, purchase a Gen AI system that does not yet meet these requirements, and then you use it in a high-risk system, then you become a high-risk provider or deployer, and then you have to fulfill those requirements. So there is this kind of because of ChatGPT, basically the legislator immediately recognized that there will be instances where you have generative AI that can be used in different settings, and they basically did not say, okay, we're not going to regulate that at all because we just don't know. They said, if you're in that setting, it doesn't make a difference if you're an AI system that was specifically developed for this, or if you're a generative AI system that might be used for this, you will be regulated as such if you use it that way. And apart from that, like a third part, they basically said that these generative AI systems, because they can be used for anything, have certain transparency requirements so that we know what they can be used for. Basically, this is the system. Basically, first, you have transparency requirements so that you know how these generative AI systems are used. They have to have so much compliance and documentation that in the end, you can read how they could be used. In the next step, you then, based on this transparency, can say, see, it can be used in a high-risk AI system. So we will see if it will be used in this high-risk sector. Or we can see if it will be used in a banned practice. And that way, we have this kind of base so that we know how generative AI is used. And then as a next step, if it is being used in a banned or a high-risk way, we can then regulate it. And you have then additional compliance issues if you're in a high-risk sector. If you're banned, you're banned. That's it. But let me tell you, this is like the most high-level thing you can talk about with the Act. This is like a really high-level view of it, because I sell it to you now as a regulator, obviously, where I say this is a grand idea and a great regulatory system, which I tend to also think, but it is a huge, huge compliance deal where you have to fulfill so much documentation, and we, as possible regulators, have to read it and understand it. And that's also why I say that GDPR will become more technical, because we will have to deal with the AI regulatory system, and it will grow into something new.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, I know how long that text is and the number of articles and recitals. So thank you so much for synthesizing it. I just want to pick up on one thing which takes us directly to enforcement, actually. And just to kind of reiterate, my understanding again of these, that the AI Act in the EU, I didn't, the idea of banned practices, I didn't know how strongly that was going to be enforced. We, in a sense, a data protection regulator, the Italian DPA, actually banned OpenAI from processing or restricted them from processing Italians' personal data for 1 month. I remember at some point last year when OpenAI started, but I suppose it's not the same. And just for the audience to kind of tell them, there's one is the banned processes. There's also high-risk systems that Marcus was referring to. This includes biometrics, which in India is a fundamental infrastructure. We have everything is through our biometric technology. So it's a high-risk system. Educational or vocational training, especially post-COVID, all of that is become almost mandated by government bodies in India in some sense, and also employment, worker management. So these are all considered high risk, right? So it's a really interesting question of, I suppose, regulatory, where you draw the line, and that's where I kind of wanted to come back to the next part of this. Is one is, we have these principles, and one way that EU is doing it by classifying, as we just talked about, product liability, looking at the developers side of things, looking at the software, maybe looking at banned practices and high risk category areas where you have more regulatory kind of insight. But the question then comes, who is going to actually implement this risk or high risk, right? And I suppose that's the next question that we have here, which is, what is the authority that is going to be drawing these lines? Who's going to assess? Who's going to be, and do we have any early indication, especially in here, Mr. Fernando, given your knowledge of this interoperability that you were talking about, right? Other limbs of government already have a view, and we saw this in India in our data protection negotiations. The reason that it went on for close to 5 or 6 years is that within government there were differing views on, what kind of processing should be included, what shouldn't be, and so on. And so one question I have for the second part of our discussion is, where is the regulatory authority going to lie? Who is going to draw these lines? How does it work in Europe? But also, where is the enforcement capacity who is going to interpret where these lines are drawn and actually enforce against AI models, which are notoriously opaque, right? Like, we know that we don't know the secret sauce that goes into many of these models. How's a regulator going to be like, tell me how your system works or your model works? So yeah, I mean, I have so many other questions, but just with that broad question, if I can go back to Mr. Fernando, I don't know if you have early thoughts on enforcement and regulation. And then Marcus, I'd love to hear the experience so far.
Thank you, Malvika, and it was really great to hear Marcus giving such a fantastic high-level overview of the AI Act, the difference between the AI Act and the GDPR. Given the fact that the GDPR itself is a one-size-fits-all model governing the processing of personal data, and how maybe GDPR also may get reshaped in the context of the AI Act. Now, we have to be mindful about two things here, Malvika, in the context of my perspective here. I chaired the drafting committee of the PDPA, but I'm not alone in the regulatory landscape here. I'm now in the private sector, giving a little bit of support to the newly established regulator to see how the baby steps can be supported by us, right? And they are taking baby steps one by one. And it's been a challenge given the fact that we are in a post-economic recovery mode. And we know how India and other countries helped us through that process. And that would mean that the law and the regulatory landscape will take time. We have to give them space and time to evolve. That said, I just want to highlight a second aspect, Malvika, is the fact that given the fact that there is no constitutional basis for privacy here in Sri Lanka, and we had to reinvent the wheel using certain other constitutional principles and not interfere with the administrative law and constitutional law and human rights law evolution in our country that has matured over the years through judicial dicta. We took a kind of a light touch approach, but we also understood that there's a need to give a phased approach for implementation. And towards that end, the law is actually not yet in operation, although the regulatory authority has been established. We just got approval just before the elections for the recruitment process. And the first set of guidelines, rules, and regulations have already been published for stakeholder comment. And that will perhaps indicate to our stakeholders as well as our international partners, including all of you, about the risk and high risk kind of aspects that may be addressed. Okay. So in terms of high risk processing, those who are in the field of data protection and privacy are familiar with a couple of basic steps that any controller engaged in such kind of processing activity has to take. In the Sri Lankan setting, there is a requirement to carry out what we call a data protection impact assessment, right? And whether you are running an AI tool or a non-AI tool or a mixed bag of the models, the kind of thing I gave you, and particularly in that example I cited earlier, there would be a requirement for the Agricultural Ministry and the Commission to carry out a data protection impact assessment because of the systematic and extensive evaluation of personal data within that system that can happen and profiling that could take place. And then, of course, in situations where there is systematic monitoring of publicly accessible areas of networks or data, there is another situation in which DPIA needs to be carried out. And then, of course, processing activities that the future regulator will define where a DPIA is needed. Now, in Sri Lanka, as you know, we are just starting the ball rolling, and the regulatory options of regard to the methodology for the DPIA is absent in the law, and that is to be done through a regulation to be published in a gazette. And we are mindful that such regulatory interventions might potentially inhibit innovation and growth. And therefore, the Data Protection Authority Board decided it was essential that each of these draft rules, regulations go through a public consultative process. So earlier this week, it is interesting that you are having this discussion now. Just earlier this week, on Tuesday, we had the first set of rules. The draft regulation on data protection impact assessment, the method and how it could be carried out, and what kind of processes need to be carried out internally by a controller. That entire draft is available for public comment. And time has been given of maybe about a month, and that may be extended. A second set of rules with regard to data protection breach notifications was also published. But more importantly, previous week, the Data Protection Management Program guideline, which imposes the transparency obligation or the accountability obligation on a controller, was also published. And those are in-house keeping rules, which will perhaps help to mitigate risk. So to answer your question, we believe preventive tools is better than a cure after a damage is done. And that kind of a light touch approach to regulation may help better strike the balance between regulation and supporting growth and innovation in the technology era. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. I just want to pick up because it's almost we're moving into our audience questions after Marcus's next intervention. So I just also the audience, if you have any questions, please, either put them in the comment section or raise your hand. But I think already, sir, you've answered one of Vanisha Jain's questions, which came up around transparency and compliance, and the applications for, the idea that you would do a DPIA for an AI application, I think is super relevant. If naturally all people who produce AIs, at least the controllers, would be hopefully also caught by the GDPR or the PDPA in the Sri Lankan context. I guess the challenge we have, and I don't know if this is a challenge in Sri Lanka, is sometimes the Data Protection Act can actually act against some of these principles because of the exceptions. So because we have this buzz around innovation and naturally everybody, data is the new oil and so on and so forth. We have a huge carve out we have a ill-defined startup exemption, if I may say so, in the Indian Act, which has no rules. So you could have all these wonderful requirements, and then you have a carve out for startups. We also do not cover publicly available personal data. So web scraping, which is undertaken by many of these models, technically, from the way I read the act, would not be covered by the legislation, which is many times I thought the point of a Data Protection Act is if your personal data is out there, there is some protection for it, especially in this world where honestly we don't even know which kind of trades are happening with our data. And so I think the tension is that while data protection acts will be the first one facing AI, they also, if they are so loosely worded or give so many carve-outs, in a way, they kind of encourage AI to not, I wouldn't say misuse data, but you can see the regulatory arbitrage that people would try and set up as startups and try and use the internet data in India at least, even if they were funded by a huge in the back end by a whole bunch of organizations to get this exemption, and then data protection would not apply. And I think there the whole product liability approach may be a second prong. I'm just thinking out loud, but we don't have anything yet. But on that note, over to you, Marcus, just on the enforcement side, and then just to let the audience know that the questions, you can start putting them in now, because after Marcus is finishing, we will then go straight into 20 minutes of audience questions. Thank you.
So because the AI Act is this kind of hybrid between product regulation and fundamental rights protection, we have a huge discussion on who will be the enforcer. Because naturally we have product regulatory bodies, which before regulated, I don't know, how telephones work. And if they have a too strong of a Wi-Fi signal, if you have a router, like these kind of things. And that can cause health issues if they do not work correctly. And on the other hand, we have DPAs, which are basically the only real body in the European Union where in every member state you have a fundamental rights protection authority, which is unique in its way. It's a kind of a weird thing. You don't have like a human rights protection authority in every member state in Europe or in any country. It's the first thing, basically. For some reason, data protection has the first unified enforcement in the EU in that sense, where every government had to install an independent authority which they could not influence the work of. So it's a really valuable asset in that sense for enforcement. And that's kind of the main problem, that on the one hand, the AI Act is a product regulation. So data protection authorities have no experience in this. They regulated data processing, not products. They never went into the development of a product before it was even on the market and said, show me what you do. What they did is react to data subject complaints. And that's down the line of the value chain, basically. And so product regulation is really different because it's, on the one hand, it's of course you have to regulate from the start, and on the other hand, you also have to innovate or allow innovation to happen way more than data protection law does by the letter of the law, because it's about data protection, not data usage in that sense. But my contention is that data protection laws will change because of this new approach. And so what we have in Germany is, on the one hand, product regulation authorities, and on the other hand, data protection authorities. Data protection authorities in the public eye have been less popular because they are afraid that they will hinder innovation because of the data subject kind of approach, where you try to hinder data processing and not as much try to enable it in that sense. We in Hamburg have a sort of different approach. We're trying to be more on the data usage kind of side and try to enable and protect when we have data subject risks. Like, we try to follow a risk-based approach, but yeah, it's difficult. On the one hand, that's why we don't really have a majority, I would say, in Germany, or in Germany, definitely, for data protection governments to be data protection authorities to be the head of the regulatory body. So that's why the German government has chosen our infrastructure authority to do this, because the Bundesnetzagentur, it's what it's called, is now envisioned to be the head authority, because they also have they have gotten some competences to enforce, for example, the Data Act or the Data Governance Act, which are also more about data sharing and data usage. And they were given this competence because of the same reason, because it was thought that data protection authorities could not enforce sort of a more open approach to data and to data being used. And so we now have this kind of at the top, we have a decision, a political decision at least, that the Bundesnetzagentur is going to do this, the infrastructure authority. Now, in Germany, we are sort of a little version of Europe, because after the Second World War, it was decided that a centralized Germany poses a threat to peace, basically. Really high level. But I'm sure you all know your history and can understand why this was thought at the time. And because of this, the government power basically lies with 16 counties that we have. It's kind of like the United States of America. We have 16 counties, they're called Länder, and they have the full competency over what happens there. And only if they decide to give away power, we have a federal government. That's how it basically works. And so the issue is that even if the federal government decides that the infrastructure agency is going to do it at the top, it's not yet decided who's going to do it at the bottom, like who's going to regulate the companies that are based in the counties, because the federal government doesn't regulate companies. It's weird. It regulates companies that, for example, work all over Germany, like telco or insurance companies. But if you look at BMW, that's regulated by Bavaria and only by Bavaria. You have to kind of get used to it. It's weird. That's why we have 16 or more DPAs in Germany. And we meet once a week and we talk and we try to have a unified approach. And it's a difficult thing, but Germany was envisioned this way, to be this kind of slow tanker that doesn't quickly change direction, but goes one way and needs time, but in the end will choose the right thing to do. And this is kind of the background. So even if the Bundesnetzagentur, the infrastructure at the top, is being chosen, we now have to think, okay, what about those 16 counties? What do they do? Do we have an independent regulatory body in these 16 counties that can take over? Well, we're here, and we definitely have expressed our interest, because we think that it makes sense to have not like 3 more regulatory bodies looking into the IT systems of companies, and having even more people basically you're having to deal with as a company. And on the other hand, we have experience as an independent body dealing with the government. And the question is, who else is going to do it then? Because you would need to install new independent bodies instead of the data protection authorities, who can approach government and say, we are not dependent of you historically, because we've been here for 30 years or more even. Oh, no, don't name it on this. I hope no German is listening to this. We've been here for a long time. And so I think that is the question that we are having right now. Like in Germany, do we have infrastructure or other product regulatory bodies? Do we have data protection authorities that are able to do this? And we have a federal level and we have a kind of a county and state level. The same thing is basically happening in Europe, which is why I went into detail with this, so that you would understand how our political system is kind of shaped. We have the Commission as a head in Europe, and they deal with AI models. They were going to regulate AI models only them. And all the other countries are now going to have to choose market surveillance authorities for AI systems and the use of such AI systems. And all the countries are deciding on different things. Netherlands using DPAs. France might be using a DPA too. In Portugal, they have established a new agency, which hasn't been there before, in Spain. In a third country, I'm sure we'll have infrastructure agencies, and they historically have not worked together like DPAs. So we'll have huge communication issues. We'll have to basically raise this whole thing from the bottom up, and that's one of the drawbacks from having this new regulation, because everyone's hot on AI. Everyone wants to do it. Everyone wants to regulate it. And I can understand this. We want to do it too, because we find it to be a fascinating subject, but that's where we are right now, where we're at.
No, thank you. That's super helpful. Also, I think so many of these discussions, as we go into the last 20 minutes of this conversation, they are rooted in a wider understanding of the context, right? I mean, so in India's data protection, the long-standing consultations that we had, there was early on quite a push to try and have federated models, because we have a federal structure as well, leaning more and more unitary as the years go by. But we have more than 28 states, 8 union territories, many of them, many types of, interestingly, shops and establishments regulation is state-run in India. So technically, you could say that, and consumer protection often starts off at the district level, actually, and the tribunal then comes up. So the consumer protection, that whole landscape often faces at the state level. We never think about it that way. So product liability approach could change things. But then internet governance, data protection has been very strongly central. Which I think does a disservice to 1.5 billion people, right? Because, or maybe more, we haven't had a census in a while. But the question is, it does become very Delhi-centric. And as someone from the South, often we worry about that, because the questions are so uniquely specific, as you say, the companies that are there, the kinds of models that they are buying from other actors and so on. We didn't get a chance to touch on one thing you picked up on, Marcus, but I'm just going to go straight into the audience question. I just want to flag the big question that came up was the independence of this infrastructure authority, right? We have a CERT in India. And I know, Mr. Fernando, you've been chairman of your CERT in Sri Lanka. I'm not sure how closely they interact with other regulators. And now there is this kind of race to regulate data, even from different ministries across the Indian government. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch. The question is, who is going to be independent of government enough to tell government when it runs its own AI models? Because we know that states are procuring AI models and running them as we speak. There are some states that have kind of policy guidelines of AI procurement, but there's no regulation currently. They just, the ones who have policy guidelines are doing it out of their own kind of free goodwill, but states should be accountable to people, not act from largesse. So with that, we didn't get to talk about that. Sorry about that. And we didn't get to talk about ADM as well, automated decision making. But perhaps we can do that in the audience questions. Like I said, we have about 15 to 20, maybe we can push it. I will ask Shashidhar, just because I know that you have your hand up and you have kind of MediaNama privileges, if you want to kick us off. And then anyone else, you can feel free to put the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A. Also, the people who are logged in through Zoom and not watching this on YouTube, I can actually unmute you and let you talk. So please feel free to put up your hand if you have a question. But over to you, Shashidhar, for the first audience question.
Thanks, Malvika. I think the first question that the audience has is a question on technical feasibility. Vanisha Jain asks, the transparency compliance requirement seem to suggest that all applications of GenAI are predictable and foreseeable. Is that true? So I think it's a question of outputs when it comes to generative AI and how explainable they are. So that's I suppose that was asked in the question kind of more towards Marcus. So that's one. Another question which has been kind of going through my head is probably a twist on this tension of data minimization and AI, right? We know that a lot of AI systems themselves are a little biased, and AI models themselves are biased. And the bias starts off from biased data sets. To correct those biased data sets, we need more data, which can add more context to the AI model and therefore add weights and sensitivities to the AI model to give better outputs. And this has large implications for AI systems which are being used by the governments for social benefits as well, right? So in that situation, how do we think about a more justice-based view of data collection and data privacy as well? Those are the two questions that I want to raise. And I think another question is coming in from the audience.
So perhaps, Marcus, you can begin with the first one on transparency.
Yeah, sure thing. So the transparency compliance requirements, I will read the question so that everyone sees. The transparency compliance requirements seem to suggest that all applications of Gen AI are predictable, foreseeable. Is that true? Certainly not. Good question. But the thing is that the AI Act does not, in its essence, it kind of has a Socratic approach because it says to not only document what you know, but also what you don't know. So if you do not know in certain instances what the AI, what the Gen AI will do, then you have to document this, and this will be a risk. This is definitely a new approach because in data protection, we kind of have a more binary 1-0 approach. Is this personal data? How is this personal data being used? And now with Gen AI, we're talking about probabilities. How might this be used by someone else? How might this output look if I put this in? And since it's impossible to put everything in to test everything out, we are dealing with probabilities. And so the documentation is also based on probability. So if we're talking about AI, we have to lose our binary thought process that we have from the GDPR or other data privacy laws, because yes, not all applications are predictable, foreseeable, but some are more likely than others. That's the answer.
I think there was the justice question, if either of you wanted to jump in on. The question of, I think, Shashidhar, that you had. And also, I think a similar one around kind of different types of sensitivities. I think this question really goes to this larger question in automated decision making that we didn't talk about. So maybe I'll kind of lump it in with that as well. The question that we have certain types of sensitivities, fundamental rights, and so on, that we try to protect in all legal regimes. The thing with artificial intelligence is that often it is post fact, and we don't really know how it's going to deal with those kinds of fundamental rights protections. And I think also because of hallucinations and data quality issues that are coming up. So can it actually, can it reproduce bias, the old question, but also can it create new kinds of effects in society if it starts providing answers to questions that are completely wrong and sometimes can target certain types of groups based on the fact that most people online say some pretty objectionable things sometimes, and it learns from that. Those are two fairly complicated questions, so I'm happy for you to answer, or there are other ones that have come up. So yeah, back to you.
So maybe I will give a very generic answer, Malvika. I mean, we could talk perhaps for little close to an hour. If you look at the various intersects of constitutional law principles, data protection principles, as well as other aspects of protection measures that may need to come in the context of what you asked. These are challenging scenarios that may have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, I would think. I would be on the side of caution in terms of responding to specific. But say but go to the extent of saying that in the context of using those examples you gave, which may have a relationship to automated decision making aspects, right? Where sometimes the data subject may want a right of review. These are kind of well set principles where international regulatory standards have been developed. In the Sri Lankan context, we have a very small inclusion within the scope of data subjects, right? Giving the ability for a data subject to get a review of a decision made by a controller which is solely based on automated processing. However, there are exemptions, and maybe the exemptions are not exhaustive enough, and that is yet to be seen how adjustments can be done. And there are exemptions where the automated processing is authorized by law, where the regulator, and this is where the future regulator may have a role to play in working together with stakeholders, scientists, developers of tools and applications, and as well as user communities to understand what is going to be authorized by the regulator in terms of automated processing, which will provide exemption from the rule governing review of output or a decision making. And then, of course, we have a very clear situation of where a data subject has given consent, and in a situation where it is necessary for the performance of a contract between the data subject and a controller, and such other criteria as may be specified by rules. So there is a blanket area hitherto uncharted territory, I would say, and this is where perhaps the future National AI Center that may potentially be established pursuant to the National AI Strategy, which perhaps identifies the ingredients for the creation of a safe and trustworthy AI ecosystem, may have to blend in, right? There are experts working on these aspects as we speak, but are we hearing all the voices, right? And discussions such as these may potentially help regulators, and I encourage regulators to engage all of you more actively so that we can learn from each other to define the territory in the future so that we don't take steps that will inhibit growth and innovation in the AI space. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've had a few more come in questions as well. So I'm going to try and club all of them because I think, unfortunately, there are so many questions and I think it is hard because they go in so many different directions. But I think for the last kind of intervention, I'm going to try and club some of these. I can see Marcus is replying live to some of them, so I won't pick that one up. So one question has come in on the Sri Lankan law specifically, and we have an expert here, so that's hopefully a simple one to go through. And Bilal Mohammed asks if exceptions for research purposes. And again, this is one of those questions of whether this will be used, especially for new AI training models and AI models that use new kind of training data and so on. He asked, are the current provisions around research exceptions adequate to support AI development for public and private entities? So I suppose in his framing, it's less of a risk and more of, is it wide enough to support AI development? And quickly, I'm just going to also check on a quick follow-up from the earlier question around the predictable and foreseeability of AI models of Gen AI that Vanisha asks is, to what extent is it a defense to say we couldn't predict this? And I think, Marcus, this is coming back to your question of how would a product liability regime think about that? I think the last question that I think maybe we didn't touch on this yet, is the question of rights of data subjects themselves. And I think the question is, one is, of course, you have a government-centered approach to liability, but then in AI models, because of this mixed data set problems, this is a more generic question, based on an example that I think this is the last example I will provide. Nikhil was earlier talking when we spoke about how someone wanted to raise a data subject access request when their data was used in an AI model, to ask how it would be used and so on, and ask for correction and so on. It's not clear that data protection authorities or anybody else can actually service that right. Is it something that you've come across already? That's a very specific question. And so I think those are the three. So the first is the Sri Lankan research exemption, the follow-up for Marcus, and then the question of rights and enforceability against an AI model, system, practice, what have you. So with that, yeah, take it away, whoever wants to go first.
I think I will leave it to Marcus to take on the transparency compliance requirements applicable or application in relation to Gen AI, predictability and foreseeability aspects. Perhaps on this question of the exception for research purposes, yes, we have. And that has been included in the context of the purpose specification framework included under the data protection principles portion. So in terms of data protection principles, while we recognize the fundamentals around lawfulness under purpose specification, we have the research exemption, and these are applicable to a controller. And the definition of a controller is wide enough to cover a public authority, a public corporation, or any other corporate entity established by written law, or even a sole proprietor. So the intersect in relation to applicability of the principles governing processing of personal data in part 1 cuts across various kinds of institutions, both in government sector and private sector. It should also mean that this exemption for research purposes is available both for public as well as private sector entities. Now, as to whether the research exemption is adequate to support AI development is a question perhaps we need to see how the law and the regulatory landscape evolves. I think Nikhil mentioned about the broader scope of processing that can be brought within the realm of the concept of lawfulness, using the legitimate interest grounds rather than depending on just data subject consent or the contractual basis for processing. And interestingly, what I see is that when it comes to data analytics and research purposes to help those data analytics that even a controller may undertake, the way things I see even in our part of the world, including in Sri Lanka, is that controllers are increasingly using legitimate interest as the basis, right? Because of the fact that when these laws are coming in situations where private sector or government sector organizations have already got a mass set of personal data, and they already have their clients and customers already in place, they would go through consent exhaustion if they have to once again onboard everybody, obtaining consent for this, that, and the other. So I think the legitimate interest criteria may be fashioned and evolved as a backup route to the research exemption to support AI as far as I would think in terms of evolving this into the next phase of development and to support innovation. But of course, I must again be on the side of caution, Malvika. I do not know how the future regulator will behave. I will not know how the law will evolve. And these are areas where we have to wait and see, and we can learn a lot from maybe the product liability approach that UAI has taken. And thanks to Marcus, we have very good insights of how those challenges, even in Europe, are being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Mark.
So I'll make it short because we don't have much time left. So to the follow-up question, if it's a good defense to say I couldn't predict this, I will counter this with another question. It would be this, like, how well would you defend a children's toy that burns, and you would say, oh, we didn't know it would burn. The question then depends, like, didn't you know? Like, how well didn't you know? Well, how is it? What's your documentation like? And in the end, the AI Act is going to be very similar. Every time you read the AI Act and you think, how is this going to apply to an AI system? Think of a children's toy and then try to apply it, because that's what they thought of when they were making the law. Then add a GDPR angle to it to have the fundamental rights protection. And now the new and challenging approach will be to think of fundamental rights as something like a burned finger. Like, how is that going to work even? How are we going to pay attention to fundamental rights in a product-oriented regulation? That's one bit. The other bit about that was brought up about data minimization. I think it's really important to consider that data minimization isn't a point in and of itself. Data minimization says in Article 5 GDPR 2 in that it is relevant and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose. And the purpose is set by the lawmaker. So if the purpose with an AI system is said to be less discriminatory and care for people's lives or whatever, and make sure that they are not being harmed, then that is a purpose that even under data minimization, under a data minimization list, would allow, for example, you could argue at least allow for retraining in order to make it more safe. That's kind of the approach that you would have. Like, data minimization does not mean do not process data. It means process data only as much as you need to. And the need is defined by the issues at hand. So I think there needs to be a more flexible approach. Data usage in a more grand scheme of things way or open data, for example, will also be possible if you think about data minimization, because that is a new lawful purpose that is broader. That's, I think, one major issue. And maybe one last thing about automated processing and data subject rights. We have a CJU case, Dun Bradstreet, Austria. Dun and Bradstreet, Austria, that is happening right now. We have new general advocates' opinions, and in the next year, we will likely have a new CJU opinion on how far these kind of data subject requests can go. I know this is not immediately relevant to you, but there might also be an interesting argument to be made from that, because in the GDPR, you need to not only inform about automated decision-making, the existence of it, but also meaningful information about the logic involved and the significance and the envisaged consequences of such processing. And the question now in this CJU case is, what about business secrets? What about the algorithm? Do we need to give the data subject our algorithm? And the Advocate General said, very wisely, no, you do not need to give the algorithm, because who will understand it? What you need to give is what the algorithm means for a data subject. What consequences are there? So it's a more kind of hands-on approach. And the interesting thing also is that it said that the business secrets, for example, do not have to be provided, but they have to be provided to the DPA, which will then check if these are true business secrets or no. So we have a new kind of approach here where we will learn more about AI systems with data subject requests in the future about how they work. And companies like a food delivery company that's called Volt from Finland, for example, they issue, I think in a yearly maybe, the algorithm transparency report. And it's an interesting read, actually, because it's in a digestible way. They try to explain how the delivery system works for like foods and how the drivers are selected, how the restaurants are selected, and shown to the consumer. So if you're interested in this, I would definitely recommend to have a look at it. Also, have a look at our discussion paper from the Hamburg DPA on whether models store personal data. It's a really interesting subject, all on the reading list of PrivacyNama. And now we are 5 minutes overdue.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I just want to end very quickly because I know the other speakers are waiting to take it away for this really interesting discussion around sovereignty. But I just want to end by thanking again both the speakers. I think you did a tremendous job taking such a complex and different approach, right, in each of these jurisdictions, both to data protection and to AI. So I can't thank you enough. I also think you made it really real. I like the idea of a children's toy as being the thing in the background when you're thinking about data protection and AI regulation, thinking of, how would you build a children's toy, and this idea of burnt fingers. I think these are all very useful heuristics. But I think the closing note is what I really hear is AI regulation and data protection, where data protection helps AI regulation is really pushing for logic. We talk about meaningful data protection, right? Data protection isn't just about consent. We keep trying to do that in India. I think somewhere we've come back to consent, but it's about how can you have meaningful data protection? How can you push for logic from these seemingly inscrutable machines? I think in any of our daily interactions, we want people to behave with, some kind of logic and some kind of sense. And I don't think we should ask for any less of our machines. So in the age of the machine, thank you so much for the last 1.5 hours. I really enjoyed it. And I hope to, stay and listen to the next discussion. So over to you, Shashidhar, Nikhil, and thanks for bringing us together for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you, Fernando. It was a really great discussion, and I really love the fact that we got into such nitty-gritty details about how things are actually working within the EU as well, within specifically Germany. That was a bit of a revelation for me that, if you had to regulate any sort of AI system coming out of BMW, it would have to be the Bavarian government, which would have to take a look at that. And we had a great session, and we now have the second session for the day, which is looking at AI sovereignty and cross-border data flows. We've got an excellent set of speakers for this session. We've got Mr. Vivek Abraham from Salesforce, Professor Rostam Newworth from the University of Macau. We've got Amlan Mohanty, who's an independent lawyer and who's also very keenly involved with a lot of digital rights and data protection norms within India as well. And we've also got Mr. Rajkaran Pannugatti, who is from Ola Crew and where the company is now trying to build a lot of India-specific LLM. And we also have Neha Chaudhary, who will be chairing the session and also setting context for this session as well. Thank you so much for all of the speakers who've come in. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you, Shashi, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation on AI sovereignty and cross-border data flows. And welcome, Amlan, Vivek, Rostam, and Rajkiran. Hopefully, we'll have an interesting discussion. I just want to take maybe a few minutes to set some context, throw open some issues that we'll be discussing over the next hour or so, and we'll dive right in. The idea of digital sovereignty, I don't think is new for any of us who've been having conversations or who've been doing work or following these debates in India and around the world. For many years now, we've been looking at this digital sovereignty in the context of data sovereignty. And now we're increasingly seeing this focus on AI sovereignty, manifesting and reflecting in increasing calls from countries to exert greater amount of control over the development as well as the use of AI within national borders, right? So by and large, focuses on the ability of a country to develop AI using its own infrastructure, training, research. If we have to look at this in two broad themes, On the infrastructure side, we could perhaps talk about it as advanced data centers, advanced computing, capabilities, supercomputers, AI chip manufacturing. And if you're looking at it in the context of, data, it manifests in the form of this idea that comprehensive, diverse, and very often localized and specialized data sets are critical when we're talking about, AI development, AI use deployment. And in the policy side, it manifests itself perhaps as mandatory requirements on data sharing, opening up data sets. It manifests itself in the form of data policy restrictions on cross-border data flows, which is definitely something that we'll talk about today, local storage of data, so on and so forth. Generally, by and large, I think we've seen about 3 or 4 arguments that talk about why AI sovereignty is important, or arguments that are made in furtherance or support of AI sovereignty. Again, not very different from those that we've had in the data protection context, right? It could take the form of national security concerns. When OpenAI partnered up with the Pentagon, I remember there were many, many articles that were written about this. Another example has always been, especially for India, the United States, and a bunch of other countries, things that China is doing when Chinese companies were able to bypass export restrictions on AI chips, and you're able to get access to these kind of technologies through cloud computing. So, a whole bunch of national security concerns tends to be one of these themes that drives it. Data protection, privacy, security is another theme that we see coming up a lot in conversations, and of course, economic competitiveness. Around the world, of course, many, many different countries, when we have conversations on digital sovereignty, or when we have conversations on AI sovereignty, very often we are tempted to look at China and perhaps a couple of other markets and say, this is where, this is perhaps the origin of that debate. But in the context of AI, we're seeing that it is not true. We are seeing efforts in the United States. They are considering regulatory measures that might ask cloud platforms to share details of certain foreign applications that might be using cloud computing capabilities if you're developing foreign AI applications, especially if there is the ability to misuse these applications. You've got a large amount of money that the European Union and Canada are pouring in into a bunch of different efforts aimed at either enhancing capacity, so either strengthening up the infrastructure piece that we were talking about, or looking at other ways in which you could look at boosting AI startups in the country, all within this broader frame of AI sovereignty and wanting increased and greater control. In India, maybe we've seen a little bit of a shift from talking about AI sovereignty in strong terms to perhaps looking at a little bit more of a PPP, public-private partnership model that might help India achieve the goals that we've set out for ourselves. It raises, much like any other digital sovereignty debate, questions around, or it brings up, it's another site, I think, of this tension between wanting technological autonomy and technological supremacy, and looking at different levers that we might be able to use to make that happen. And hopefully these are some of the questions, and some of this tension is what we'll delve into in the next few minutes. And Amlan, maybe if I can start with you, right? Just, is there anything new? Is there anything different here? What's new about sovereign AI? How is it different from other concepts of digital sovereignty? That's one. And second, if you could just also then lean into a discussion on your perspective on data localization and local storage of data, or any kind of restrictions on cross-border data flows in the context of sovereign AI. Let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Neha, and thank you, MediaNama, for having me here. Real pleasure to be here. So, Neha, firstly, thanks for the introduction. I think great context setting. The way that I think about this is really the way that you started, right? Which is that this is not a new conversation. We have been talking about digital sovereignty for many years now. This is essentially about control, access, supervision by the government, by the sovereign, over important technological infrastructure. You mentioned that data sovereignty is primarily the conversation we've been having. And indeed, that is the conversation we've been having in India. But I also have been thinking about digital sovereignty in the context of cloud infrastructure, right? So that's, again, while I was at Google, a conversation that we have been having with governments and other stakeholders. So I really think about this in three ways, right? Which is that we've had this conversation about digital sovereignty, primarily in the context of data or cloud infrastructure. So one, what is different about AI sovereignty? Two is this question of data, and I think how is data so integral to AI sovereignty, and in what ways is that something we should probably talk about? And three is assuming that data is integral to this concept of AI sovereignty, what is the importance of cross-border data flows, which is really the topic that we want to talk about, right? So, I don't want to kind of get too deep into any of these concepts, but I'll say, briefly on each of these points. I do think there is something significantly different about AI sovereignty when we're talking about digital sovereignty. And I think primarily because of how governments view AI infrastructure as fundamentally different from other kinds of technical infrastructure we've seen in the past. And I think just as outside observers to this, we need to think about essentially the AI stack, right? So we need to really be thinking about AI infrastructure or sovereignty from the concept of the stack, starting from chips to cloud to data to models to algorithms to software that's running all of this, and eventually applications as well. And so you really need to have a holistic view of sovereignty, which is very different from how we had thought about sovereignty in the specific context of data or cloud infrastructure. Two is on this question of how data is integral to AI sovereignty. I think it's very clear that any model that's being trained today is primarily being trained on data. But this is where I will say that we need to, I think, revisit the conversation about non-personal data, which I know we have been having in India for a long time, because really, if you get into the weeds, you'll see that a lot of the model training is happening on anonymized data, right? For several reasons. But again, this leaves us with where are the safeguards around this, right? Where are the safeguards around processing for anonymized data? Where is the industry guidance on anonymization standards? If you're thinking about it from a sovereign point of view, are governments recognizing the inherent strategic value of anonymized non-personal data to serve their sovereign interests, right? So that's point number two. Data is integral to AI. And then point number three, right? Where does this land us on the conversation of data flows? And I think that's where perhaps this is a bit of a kind of tenuous link between data and data flows. I actually don't think there is a significant relationship on the question of sovereignty, AI sovereignty, when you think about data flows. Of course, there are questions about data flows promoting scientific knowledge, the value of sharing data across borders for the joint development of large language models, about the importance of localizing data to protect cultural values. But I do think that we really need to dig into whether there is something there, and I'm kind of 50-50 on that. I'll stop there. Love to hear more thoughts on this.
Perfect. I think, Vivek, that's a great segue. If I can just come to you, right? The last thing that you said, do you think Amlan is 50-50? I'm curious if you have an opinion and if you think, what is the nexus? Do you think it's a tenuous one or not? That's one. And second, given that I'm now bringing a business into the conversation, I just want a little bit of a zoomed out perspective also on how do you think, how does it work, right? How do you think about concepts of AI sovereignty? How do you think about whether this affects the development of the ecosystem itself? Like I was saying earlier, one of the concerns that's constantly been talked about is this economic opportunities, right? Do you think that it works one way or the other for the development of the ecosystem, smaller players in particular? And yeah.
No, thanks for that, Neha. And just want to echo Amlan here that it's great to be here back at PrivacyNama, and a couple of great discussions. But on sovereignty and AI, I think I agree with Amlan. I think the data sovereignty and AI sovereignty are essentially two very different conversations, at least in observation. So data sovereignty is coming from the perspective that of fear that if we let data out of our borders or out of our control, essentially there are bad actors out there or foreign entities out there who will use the data in a way that will be harmful for our citizens or may not protect our data or enable harm that may come to our citizens if data is leaked. the conversations that I have been having with different entities in the government, and it's not a conversation that's limited to India, across the world, in fact, AI sovereignty is all about innovation, leading in innovation. And the fear there is not so much about the harm that AI will cause or foreign AI will cause, but the fact that if we don't make a move right now, we might end up lagging behind. And I think it's very different. And every time there is a conversation about data going out, or our data being used in AI, it's not so much that our data will get leaked, or harm will come to the citizens. It's essentially the fact that we are not able to develop India specific AI, or a region specific AI, or a purpose specific AI, which will be more useful for us. In fact, if you are going around the country and talking to various governments, state governments, or government entities, I think each one of them is very, very keen on using AI, and I don't think any one of them really have a concern on whether it's Indian AI or foreign AI. I think all of them have a problem of managing data, and they're sitting on tons of data. They all have problems in actually implementing policy at the ground level, and for a lot of them, they're feeling that it's a data issue. I think they're not able to use data to really identify some of the gaps in policy execution. So I don't think there will be a concern where AI will, like, foreign AI will not be used in. I think they're okay with that. I think at the policy level, at the central government, it's more about, can we encourage more of Indian AI players coming up? And I think it's coming from a place where AI is one of those spheres of life today where you can actually, everybody's at reset zero. Everybody's in square one right now. We have the opportunity right now to really take the leadership position. And we've had this discussion in the last 1 or 2 years. I think, if you look at where players like the US or China or some other companies in EU, obviously they've developed their LLMs, they've developed their models, and I think they're there. And India's yet to get to that space. But what India has is a lot of data. And the conversation is about, can we use this data as a strategic advantage to develop something that is useful for 1.5 billion people, and then use that scale to really achieve a leadership position? And in that effort, I don't see any discrimination against foreign media, and I'm using the air quotes over here. Um, and I think a lot of people are open to using the foundational models that have been developed by players outside, and developing India context specific AI. Um, you're hearing a lot of talk about the voluntary commitments that have been put out by the government or being considered by the government. Um, there is some element of pushing companies to develop India context specific AI. It's not really a fear of, oh, what will foreign AI come and do to Indian citizens. That fear is more or less gone right now. And in
So
my
it's more
opinion,
about the opportunity
it's more
and
about the opportunity. Yeah.
India specific
Yeah.
applications. Rajkiran, if I can come to you, right? I imagine you will have a different take for all of us here. You folks have been, I think, strong proponents of AI sovereignty across. I mean, even the framing that Amlan was talking about, right? The entire stack is something that you believe that sovereignty should extend across all of the layers of the stack. So I mean, I want to hear from you what the thinking is, what the ambition is, things like that. That's one. And second, um, the similar question that I posed to Vivek as well, right? When you're talking about, and imagine you'll give us the other side, when you're talking about sovereign AI, what do you think is the impact of these kind of conversations on businesses like yours? Is the problem statement that having conversations on sovereignty is good for smaller players? It will encourage more smaller players. It will encourage more. I mean, just to pick up from the last thing that Vivek said, the development of more India-specific applications. And is it possible to do both? Is it possible to talk about sovereignty as well as global sort of competitiveness and reach? I've thrown a bunch of stuff, but pick up whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. And nice to organize this event, and really glad to be here. And great panel and great discussions. So as you have rightly identified, basically we from the beginning identified, especially on the sovereignty, that we need to have control over the entire stack. We can't be dependent or solely dependent. I'm not saying we shut off from the foreign influences, but we can't be solely completely dependent on any part of the stack, whether it's the chips, whether it's the cloud infrastructure, whether it's various kinds of models that go into a typical AI stack, or the ultimate foundational models itself. So as you would know, we have launched our own cloud, we have launched our own foundational LLM, we have launched our own embedding models, and we are going to launch our own chip as such. So we are working on the entire stack. And the reason is fairly simple here. Basically, if you have and this is going to be a very critical technology that's going to change the world, right? And if you have a very core dependency on any part of it, right, then you are going to be crippled at any point of time. You have a risk, right? Not just as a company, but for the country too, right? At the same time, we don't want to be completely blocking the foreign players, right? We always complain that it's not, the Indian perspectives are not represented accurately. So when we say that, it also means that we are not providing the data in an accurate manner, and we are allowing the stereotypes to be there, right? So sovereignty should not be seen just as protecting yourself for your economic benefit, but also you want to enable foreign players also to represent you in a way that we want to, because we also see, as an Indian perspective, we want to use the technology that's coming from the Western world or the other countries, like whether it's Europe, whether it's US, whether it's China, either ways, right? We also build on top of that. We also stand on the shoulders of those giants, right? So I think it's a balancing act is the take that we have. We can't be completely dependent on any part of it. If there is some section of it, some section of the A stack that we don't have control over, then you don't have a say. You don't have a say, especially like, the chips, for example, right? Or the foundational models, which is anyways going to be very limited number of companies that are going to do these foundational models. And when we look at the policies that they follow, right, often we see that most of the concerns that are related to, let's say, Indian specific cultures are ignored, probably because of the market, probably because of lack of data. And hence, it should be a balancing act is how we look at it. In terms of strategic too, like, I again go back to, let's say, the colonial times, where we used to be the supplier of raw cotton, and then we used to get the processed clothes back. Now we are again somewhat in a similar situation. We generate humongous amount of data, right? They're all owned and saved, especially at least owned by multinational companies or foreign owned companies. And you yourself don't have control over it. And we are using the processed models on top of it, right? So it's the same old story that we generate data. We are probably the biggest generators of data, if I'm not wrong. And we all still complain on lack of our Indian cultural specific data. But at the same time, we're also consumers of this output or the models, because we are probably the biggest IT population, and we are probably the biggest consumers of this output of the models, right? So it's going to be the old story again, and we can't allow that to repeat. At the same time, we don't want to block them off, right? That's how we see it. We need to have control over that. In fact, while one of the efforts that we were doing was, especially with regard to the representation corresponding to our ancient history, right? There are many manuscripts that we were going to libraries and fetching them and scanning them and converting them into digital data. And when we actually tried to get hold of these, right? When we went to these libraries, what we found that many of our old original manuscripts are sold off to places like Germany. They're present in libraries over there, and they're sold off at a price that is like throwaway price. I mean, even a waste paper is probably priced at the same price as what we sold these for. And they are present in like say, the German libraries or the Western libraries. And we ourselves don't have access to our own ancient culture or history, right? The original manuscripts. The other part is also that, once you enable, if we look at sovereignty, one is economic one and the cultural one. Right? On the cultural aspect, who are we making the gatekeepers of the representation? Right? Do we have control over that representation? And unless you provide your perspective, unless your perspective is weighed properly, then you're allowing external guys to be the gatekeepers of your cultural aspect.
So, two themes I'm picking up, right? One is this question of cultural aspects, and I want to stick with that a little bit. And of course, this larger question of a balancing act that we spoke about. And Rostam, if I can come to you, you've looked at in your work, I think you've studied a bunch of different markets and sort of regulatory approaches across the world. If you can help us unpack this question of cultural approaches or cultural differences and its manifestation, say in bias, that's sort of one question, right? And what is the kind of influence that has on discussions of AI sovereignty? We've heard from Raj about perhaps the thinking in India, but I'm curious if we're also seeing this happening in other parts of the world. That's one. And second, when I look at everything that we've discussed so far, at the end of the day, we'll come down to the law or public policy as a tool to operationalize a lot of these things, no matter which side you look at, right? So what are we seeing? Any thoughts on legal frameworks that are being, currently used to operationalize this one way or the other? I know there are specific themes that I want to pick up, and Amlan, I'll come to you right after this, perhaps on the non-personal data question. But yeah, Rostam, if we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for having me. It's really great to be part of this interesting conversation. And I would have picked up on this cultural point right away because it, in fact, reminds me a lot of a debate we had in the context of global trade regulation over the last 30 years with regard to should there be an exception to cultural products and in the WTO. And now I see a similar debate here with regard to AI or digital sovereignty. And for me, it's not a 50-50. I think it's a 100-100 approach in a sense, like Marcus mentioned before. I think it's very important not to think in binary terms here and to seek more the complementary aspects, namely that and that brings us back to trade theory, in fact, that is built upon cultural diversity, paradoxically. So it is the diversity of nature that gave the first incentive to do trade. And then that's where I think our perception was wrong in the last 20 years, that cultural diversity was seen as an obstacle to trade. And now I'm afraid we're making a similar mistake if we think that like the issue of AI is a solely local issue. I think it's a global issue, and we see now also a push for like even the EU pushing for like this digital or AI sovereignty.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have a push for a global digital compact by the United Nations in the context of the Summit of the Future. So, and we have the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which clearly, in my view, reflects that there is a global consensus among all the UNESCO members that this is a global issue. The same is I think before it was also mentioned, it's a cross-cutting issue, AI. It can be used for so many diverse fields and applications. And in that sense, I hardly see that someone can go alone. It's a bit like, I think sovereignty, when we thought about it in terms of territorial sovereignty, or we can even think of individual sovereignty in a way, I think it's a bit of a fiction, a legal fiction, which is helpful, I think, to start with, but it is never like possible to maintain in the long run. So I personally think that AI sovereignty is useful as long as we see it as a tool to be part of the global debate. But it should not stop at a total like substitution of any foreign contact, because I don't
Can you
think
unpack? Sorry to interrupt you. Can you unpack that a
Yeah.
little bit? Are these things contradictory? Is it contradictory for me to say sovereignty while at the same time also saying, hey, global compact, multilateral frameworks, let's all, I mean, is there an inherent contradiction in that? And how do
No,
you
but I
allow
mean,
both of
yeah.
them to coexist? Yeah.
No, that I think that's why I said like it depends on how we look at it, and not as conflicting to have a global debate and a local. In order to contribute to the global debate, you need a local something. I mean, a basis. So in that sense, I think it is complementary and not conflicting or contradictory to a global approach. To the contrary, and we need it. This is exactly the point. Like in cultural law, international law, there's an equality of all cultures, and that's why we should all be part of that. And for that purpose, I think it is a very good point to push for like what is called sovereign AI or national or domestic pushes. But at the same time, we know from, for example, the whole trade linkage debate when it comes to national security, nobody can do it alone, and we have so many global problems that nobody can address alone, from climate change to pandemics or something. So I think what is important is that we look at it not from the perspective of a mutual like contradiction, but from mutual complementarity. And I think even that when we look at the competition between China and the United States, for example, that two already very powerful and well-established players in that sense, they also face a paradox that they actually need each other's kind of data or knowledge and know-how, even though they can do it alone, because you still want to be globally appealing with your products as well. So I think we need to learn, that's what I always emphasize, is to see like the complementarity rather than the conflicts. And it's not a contradiction to push for national or sovereign AI and to take part in the global digital compact. To the contrary, it's the condition without which it's not possible to take part in it. And I think that is where I stand at the moment. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
And for the second is just this applies also to the legal frameworks. I mean, we have seen now very competing approaches. Like you can say the EU went very comprehensive with the AI Act. They claim to be the first. They were the first to propose it. In the meantime, China has enacted several special laws. So we see this more specific approach or more comprehensive. And we also saw like maybe the US a more laissez-faire market-driven approach at first. And I think in this respect too, we make a mistake that we say it is either this or that. I think the EU will have to go more specific in some areas, and China is, I think, working also on a more comprehensive framework. That's why some of their laws are called interim measures or model laws in a way. So I think it is always this contradiction that different doesn't mean it's not possible. We are not facing the same issues. And that should also be carried into the legal debate, where we know that regulatory competition or co-opetition, compete a bit, but also cooperate, is not a contradiction and not an impossibility. It's the foundation of, I think, a fruitful collaboration at the global level. So I think what is necessary, AI is an oxymoron, as many say, and we need to carry this contradictory element into the debate, but see it from a more complementary perspective. I hope that answers both questions.
No, it does, and I think it gives me a good framing to come to Amlan as well, right? If I were to just this business of partnerships, multilateral agreements, the manifestation, I mean, again, like talking about cooperation, etc., what should be the focus, right? I know you've looked at trade and data, and this is something that you study. Do you think the focus should be data transfers? Do you think it should be tech transfers? Do you think it should be cross-border data flows? Since you brought up non-personal data, do you think it should be about non-personal data? What should we do? right? So that's one. And Shashi has given me another question, and he said that, okay, maybe I'll save that for somebody else, and I'll start with him. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really a question that I'm going to respond with another question, right? Which is really, what is, firstly, I think we've moved beyond this conversation on data localization, right? So I think we sparked that. But I think the question that I'll respond to your question with is, what are going to be the new battlegrounds around which questions of data governance are going to be contested in the context of AI sovereignty? And I have some few thoughts there, which I'll share. But maybe just before that, respond to two things that have come up in this conversation. And I think just first on the point that Vivek made, right, about how questions of AI sovereignty are actually about innovation. While that's true, and I see where he's coming from, I mean, let's be clear about this, right? This is not a different conversation. AI sovereignty is also about access and control and supervision, right? Let's make no bones about it. Because if you're, for example, talking about sensitive applications of AI, right, military applications of AI, sure, there is a sense that, you want to build some of these technologies locally, but it's really about saying, do we have a kill switch, right? Do we have sufficient supervision about how our data is being used for these very sensitive applications? So I do want to make clear that, when countries are thinking about sovereign AI, yes, they are thinking about building, locally from the ground up, the entire AI value chain, but they are also talking about control and supervision. So we should definitely, I think about that. Two, right, is this question, I think Vivek again mentioned, right, this idea of foreign AI. I mean, I would ask again this panel and elsewhere, which is, what do we mean by foreign AI, right? What is foreign AI? What is local AI? And, that really brings me down to this idea, which is, for me, sovereignty is not a binary, right? It's actually a relative concept. You're never going to be able to reach full sovereign AI or full sovereignty. I mean, just think about it, again, what we're doing today. Like, let's say, Indian government is promoting, Tata Electronics to build chips in India, right? That's being done in partnership with PSMC, right? So, or, Ola, obviously, with Kruthrim. Is every piece component of that chip being produced in India, right? But there is a sense that, there is this relative notion that there is less dependence on a foreign actor, right? Or something of that sort. So I do want to kind of frame this also as the idea of sovereignty being a relative concept and something on a sliding spectrum that, countries are going to aspire to over a period of time. And that brings me really to, I think, and I really think this is the meat of this conversation, right? Because we can talk about sovereign AI till the cows come home, but how does this all link back to data? And this is the question that you were asking. And for me, really, rather than answer that question, I think we should just focus on what are the technology trends, right? What's happening on AI right now? And let's start with this question of training, right? And we can come to inferencing later. But when it comes to training, right, what are the data sets on which AI models today are being trained? And really, I think that's where really this new battleground, the new contestations on data governance are going to occur, because it's not on the personal data of millions of citizens. That's already happened, right? Common crawl, the kind of data scraping that's already occurred. The models that exist today, the most powerful advanced models, they already have all of that data, right? And as I mentioned, they're not interested in the data that Amlan has or what data in that data set links back to Amlan, right? This is not the business model of targeted personalized targeted advertising, right? It's a completely different model. They care and they want, and they're only interested in anonymized data sets, right? And that's what data is being trained on. So, that's what's happening. And that's why I think we need to have that conversation on non-personal data. But two, I think increasingly the way these models are going to become more powerful, more capable is when they have really small, localized, specialized data sets that are going to be licensed. Right. And I think that's going to be increasingly an area in which we're going to have to start thinking from the lens of sovereignty, right? Which countries have these data sets? Why do some countries have these data sets and not others, right? Again, this is going to be a question about cultural preservation, right? You want to train a model to be able to understand a language for which data doesn't exist. How are you going to be able to train that model, right? So I think there are all of these questions about the specific types of data on which new and more capable models are going to be trained, and what are the larger governance questions around that. Two is, I think there's going to be a really important and interesting link between data and copyright, right? Where I think these questions about larger issues around, trade and, for example, cross-border data flows are going to play out, right? Do we need to revisit the TRIPS agreement, right? What is the role of the WTO in trying to think about questions of, copyright exceptions versus enabling data access? I don't think we've even begun to sketch the surface of that. And three, I think, is another point that came up, which is this idea there is going to have to be international cooperation around these ideas, right? Like I said, we've moved away from data localization because there has been global consensus of the need for the data free flow with trust. But I do think this is really going to, I think we're going to have to test these questions when there is going to be another pandemic, right? Or there is another situation where countries around the world are going to have to collaborate. And I think AI is going to have to play a really important role in that, right? Let's say there's a new health emergency, 5 years from now, I can imagine there are going to be an important role for AI models. And if we're thinking about joint collaboration between countries, what role will data and copyright have to play in that? And are our larger domestic governance frameworks and larger international multilateral treaties equipped to deal with those situations?
Bunch of stuff there. Vivek, do you want to respond to anything that Amlan had said? Because he responded to you. If you do, I'll give you 30 seconds.
No, nothing particularly that I would like to add on, except for the fact I just want to echo the point that he said, what is foreign AI? And I think that's a very tenuous concept in itself. And I absolutely agree with him. There are already pre-made blocks available out there. Nobody's going to be making, it's very few people are going to be making foundational models from scratch. It's very expensive. By the time you have a foundational model worth using, you're already behind in the rat race as of today. So what you essentially should be doing is focusing on getting the right contextual data, building the context-specific AI that you can use with the competitive edge that you have, or with the data that you have. But it's very unlikely, given the number of foundational models that are out there, it's meaningful to make another foundational model just because you can. So yeah, I think that's the point that I wanted to pick up. But yeah, back to you, Neha, if you wanted to just take the conversation forward.
So sure, there is actually one question that had come up since we're talking about this is the question that Shashi had asked, actually, right? Which is one of the audience questions that's come up. And I want to go back to cross-border data flows because we're talking, that's something that we're supposed to be talking about in the session as well. One of the things that the question is that data privacy laws are different in different geographical regions. How will this impact cross-border data flows, especially in the context of AI? And I wanted you to come in because, you do, basically you're a global company, and this is, I'm sure, an issue that you've grappled with on a daily basis. And there is one more, which I will throw open to both Vivek and Raj, actually, right after Vivek, is in what ways can data policies strengthen digital sovereignty in the face of global digital inequality? And I imagine, again, here, both of you will have a different take. So, yeah.
Okay. Yep. So privacy versus data flows in the AI world. I think it's a very, very pertinent question. I think a very good example of why people are very careful about AI, or sorry, how people have been careful about data, not why, how people have been careful about data is, the example that I always use is, if you have been shopping on this very popular shopping e-commerce company, and if you get an order update on your Google Mail account or Yahoo Mail account, you'll essentially get just a number and a button, basically, and the data for that order will essentially go back to the portal. And the reason for that is because they don't want to let that data or any shopping or e-commerce or pricing data go out of their system, and train AI or train models that are outside of the system. I think as Salesforce and as a company that really deals with business, this has been the primary issue, that you don't want insights or you don't want data coming from your business, your company, cross-pollinating other models that other companies are going to be using. There are, obviously competitive issues, but there are also liability issues. By chance or by some mechanism, you're leaking customer data into your foundational model or the foundational models that you're using, and somebody else prompt engineers it out of the model at the other end. It's a massive, massive leak issue. But having said that, in geographies where um, there are data privacy constraints or data localization constraints, there is a way to ensure that you don't have your data sent to the model. There are ways where you can mask the prompt, or you can remove the sensitive data and you send it out to the prompt creator or the prompt maker, and the prompt maker essentially sends a generalized prompt to the model, and you get an answer, and you can repopulate the output from the model with your specific personal data, or you can use the templated answer to arrive at the specific response that you're looking for. Um, and there is an expense, or there is a cost associated with it. Sometimes you do need a human in the loop to ensure that you're not accidentally leaking data. Sometimes you do need contractual agreements with the foundational model creators to ensure that they don't store your prompts, regardless of the fact that there may be no meaningful personal data or competitive data that's going out. But having said that, I think there are mechanisms in place. People are using it. I don't see a concern really on that front, where if you don't want to share data, you can still leverage the abilities of the model and get the advantage or the benefits of using AI in your operations. The other question, if you can just repeat for me, Neha, I've kind of forgotten.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
We'll move on, because I'm also just looking at the clock a little bit. Raj, if I
Okay.
can come into you, and one, if you had any quick thoughts or any responses to what Vivek had shared, that's one. Second, I think there's a question that's specifically come in, that's directed to you. If sovereign AI is necessary for appropriate cultural representation, could that be achieved by tailoring the output of an LLM? I mean, culture is a theme that we've spoken about a fair bit, and I mean, just sort of sticking with that, right? I had a follow up of my own, which is also about just uh, in the context of, I mean, while I'm wise to, we've been talking about the economic opportunity, we've been talking about why it is that we need to do it, but I did want to bring in, and Vivek touched upon this a little bit, I did want to bring in the privacy and security aspects into the conversation as well, right? What is your thinking in terms of how do you ensure all of that? One of the arguments that's consistently been made against sovereignty of any kind is the fact that it has potential impacts on privacy, it has impacts on security. So how do you think about it, and how do you ensure that it happens when you're looking at perhaps scenarios of any kinds of restrictions on cross-border data flows, given that's the theme of the session, or any other manifestation of AI sovereignty as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, before I come to your question, I just wanted to second the point that Amlan was talking about, at least the reference where, when we look at the time around pandemic, right? Here in our discussion, we are heavily focused on countries that are capable of doing well with the restrictions that a sovereign AI comes with, right? There are many countries out there which are not capable of that yet, and we need to be conscious about those countries too. Just like what happened in pandemic, we have been conscious about all our neighbors, many other countries who cannot afford vaccines, etc. I think we have to have similar approach here too. When we want to have a control, we don't have, in other words, we call Atmanirbharta, right? We need to be able to rely on ourselves, but at the same time, we also need to help the world. We need to play also with the Western countries, etc. Sorry, now coming to your question about sorry, there was a audience question, right? Basically, is sovereign AI is necessary for appropriate cultural representation?
Yep.
Would that be achieved by tailoring the output of an LLM? Not always, only to an extent. So the analogy that I would typically say is, if let's say someone a kid has been trained from childhood until, let's say, undergrad, until they graduate in a particular way, and suddenly you want to tune them to work in a different way once they join your company, it doesn't always happen, right? So there needs to be something from the foundation and from the sovereign AI to really ensure that, right? You can't always just tailor the output. Yes, you can definitely moderate, you can definitely improve it, you can make substantial changes, but not always. The other question that you had was about how do we enforce
privacy and security. Privacy and security. Yeah.
Yeah, privacy and security are absolutely necessary, right? How do we enforce? I think it differs between an established company and a startup. Many startups are not in a position, or they're not even exposed to such scenarios. And for them to build such an infrastructure to enable and enforce, I think it's quite a difficult job, and their government needs to come in and provide ways to be able to enforce that. At the same time, for bigger companies, I think it's possible to build many such components to ensure such controls are in place, right? I think Vivek was alluding to data leaking into from your sovereign space to another sovereign space, and then you want to ensure that that kind of leakage does not happen. Yes, you need to be conscious of it every step of the way that you build. Every product that you are enabling it, right? You need to have a consistent thinking from this point of view. And it's not an easy job, but it is possible to enable that.
Got it. Perfect. Okay, I think there's one more question on culture, but maybe I'll change to Rostam and I'll come to you. There's one audience question, and I wanted to follow up on some of the themes that Amlan had flagged as well. Because when we're talking about, I mean, he's opened up revisiting trips. So I wonder if you have an immediate sort of response or thought to that. Considering, I mean, trade is something that you brought up as well, right? And I think that also ties into the question that Mansa had asked us, which is, I think, about good examples of multilateral frameworks, if any, that position AI as a net positive for global innovation rather than a zero-sum game.
Yeah, thank you. I read that question. It's a very good question. I think I'm afraid there is no such multilateral framework, really. Maybe UNESCO's recommendation is a beginning and reflects at least, I think, a common spirit behind. The WTO is in a crisis, which would provide, I think, a useful platform, but is in a crisis. And also, as Amlan mentioned, I think it needs a very strong reform, because it was built in a pre-internet era, and the TRIPS agreement it hasn't been working, in my view, even before the recent rise and hype about AI. I mean, and the whole distinction between goods and services has become obsolete. And the thinking there also, I read a very good article by, I think, Anupam Chanda, where he said it was impossible to conceive of a good being at the same time a good and a service. So it's either or. So again, I come always back to this: we need a new thinking. And that needs to be translated into the relevant laws and frameworks, and institutional frameworks in particular. I think at the institutional level, we have to work because it is there where we can allow people to voice the different opinions. And then what is extremely important to reach is, I think, a consensus on the terminology in particularly, because I think when we talk about data, there can be so much there can be so many misunderstandings, because can data not be anonymized and then created in a way that we know they are personal data, and so on and so forth. And also, what about synthetic data, for example, is something where we need also the technology community to come in and have a very intense debate globally and interdisciplinarily, in my view. So I hope that answers your question in a short time. And the question that was posed. Yeah.
Yes, it does. And I'm going to maybe just ask you to stick on and give me quick closing comments in about a minute and a half. Feel free to pick up on any of the themes that we've got that we've discussed so far, or if you have maybe just one recommendation, right? You said that I mean, you're advocating in favor of, you said both of them can coexist and should coexist together, but any quick closing comments on that theme, maybe?
Yeah, maybe just the point about security and innovation. I think also here is also a kind of misconception that the two are competing. In fact, I think we know that business cannot flourish in a completely uncertain environment, and some security, some rules are always necessary. I think here, especially when we look at the interim measures by the from the People's Republic of China on generative AI, I think this is very often misunderstood, that here this national security term or the safety aspect is always seen in a political way, but I think it also has an economic aspect which must be considered, because any product, when it's not safe, will also backfire on the company distributing it. So I think here this is another excellent example that we really need to think differently, that it's not a zero-sum game as in the question, it's a win-win situation that we have to look for. And that involves every individual, every local, and also the global level of law and policy making. That would be my final take. I hope in a minute.
How do we look at win-win? How do we make win-win happen?
Oh, how do we make win-win? I'm thinking lose-lose actually at this point, because there's just so much to unpack. But maybe three final kind of straight comments based on what I'm hearing, right? One, I know I kind of opened the door to the elephant in the room around non-personal data. I would love to, if we had more time, I'd love to hear Rustam talk a little bit more about this, but I know the EU has been thinking about restrictions on cross-border transfer of non-personal data. This is in the Data Act, and several sectoral rules. Should India and other countries be thinking about this as well? I'll leave that open. Two is, I think this idea of, cultural preservation. I do think, right, in the specific context of data governance, kind of legal governance frameworks, there is going to be a conversation about companies required to train AI models on local data alone. The reason I say this is, even if you look at kind of some of the legal kind of regulatory developments in India, whether it was the AI advisory of March 2024, the idea was, we're getting a kind of output in India that we don't expect to happen in India. And we think the reason for that is these are foreign companies deploying foreign services in India based on models that are trained on foreign data. So I do think there could be a future conversation about having to train AI models only on data only in India. By the way, I don't agree or disagree with any of you. I'm just saying kind of where these contestations are likely to occur. And the final point,
I'm very tempted to ask you to take a position, but I'll be nice.
Not on this conversation.
Amlan, actually, the next session is on non-personal data.
Gosh. I'm glad I've not been invited for that. And the third piece, I think something that Vivek alluded to, right, which I really think is really this conversation about how do we bring potentially a win-win, right, which is, maybe this conversation around cross-border data flows, sovereignty is going to be a moot question if we can really focus on privacy-preserving technologies. And I do think on-device processing, of AI technologies is going to be the future. We're seeing Apple kind of AI products really emphasize this. We're not sending anything on the cloud. Even if we do send it to OpenAI, we're going to ask for informed consent with a big giant pop-up, right? But really the idea is, if we process this on your device, can you trust us? And I think that makes all conversations around data transfers moot.
Okay, perfect. Vivek, since he's tagged you, quick response to that. And because I want to be devious, two things that Amlan said: opinions on requirements to train on local data, and opinions on non-person data restrictions. And a wonderful question, which I think is a great closing one, which I will give to Vivek and Raj. Do you think sovereign AI can compete on a global scale? Raj is already nodding yes. Vivek. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I will just deflect this question to the previous answer, what Amlan said, that what is sovereign AI, right? Yeah, I guess, in theory, yes, you can have a sovereign AI that could compete globally. Obviously, and if you're talking from the India specific case, and obviously you've got these, US-based examples and EU-based examples where they are quite good and they are showing good results. So I don't see any reason why there can't be any India-specific LLM that can compete on the global scale as well. But honestly, the competitive advantage is going to be the data in India. I don't think we have the capital or time to really catch up. And most importantly, we don't have the hardware also to continue keeping that competitive edge. And that's always going to be an issue for us unless the government and the private sector get together and plonk a $15 billion or $20 billion fab in India that cranks out the chip supply that we need to ensure that we keep training good foundational models here in India, because we are always going to be dependent on hardware from outside of the country. Having said that, non-personal data regulations, or it is an important factor. I mean, obviously, I've mentioned this is the competitive advantage that we have had.
Yeah.
But I think here, I don't want to go to a time where companies are being told that you need to start sharing data. This is your national duty, and this is, data is oil, and this is our resource, and therefore, I think there is a lot of muddied concepts there. Does data exist before it is collected? And I think that's a very philosophical question. And who pays for this particular collection cost per se? Um, I mean, yes, we have to solve that problem somehow, but incentivize and use the right structures to really get it into the ecosystem rather than forcing it or mandating it. Because once you start doing that, then innovation just flies away from the country. Then people are not going to develop India-specific stuff. It's always going to be very templated stuff that's going to be coming to India.
Raj, then quick
Yeah.
responses on, do you agree with that? Because I think that you folks, if nothing else, will agree on the importance of data, and India opportunity is really in data and diversity, and but maybe you might differ on sort of ways to get there. So quick responses to that, right? To some of the stuff that Vivek said, which also flows from two things that Amlan had flagged on requirements to train on local data, any restrictions on non-person data, or what are these incentives? I think that was the word that Vivek had used, and that'll be the final word, because I can see Shashi has also come on to sort of nudge us in the direction of closing. So yeah.
Yes. I'll keep it quick. I agree with most of what you are saying. I think you got it right. So in terms of, what's the advantage, especially, when it comes to vernacular, the audio, I mean, once you move out of the text to audio, you can see immense amount of advantages that you can do with the sovereign ones. By the way, when we say that the pursuit of sovereign AI is not about isolation, it's about finding the right balance between the fostering domestic innovation and participating in the global AI ecosystem, right? And we believe that it comes from developing core capabilities, right? And we can't be dependent on others. We can develop our own. I think there was a question. You think sovereign AI would be able to compete on a global scale?
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. It does, and when I say that, it doesn't mean we shut doors to data coming from outside. Whether we can do it just based on ourselves, we're dependent on ourselves. Yes, absolutely, yes. And we did that. We did it. Of course, we are nowhere close to the biggest models like OpenAI and all, but at least when you compare the 7 billion parameter models, we are very close to that, right? I think with that, I'll close my remarks saying that sovereign AI is not about isolation. We must not lose sight of international collaboration, but same time we need to have all the core capabilities that we need to remain competitive and probably have an edge.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. I'm glad that we're ending on some level of consensus of collaboration and complementarity. We've differed very much on very many other different aspects of what this means, understanding it, unpacking it. So many different aspects, everything from data and privacy to international regulatory instruments. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we've been able to give you a flavor of what this was. And Shashi, over to you for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Raj Kiran. Thank you, Professor Rostam, and thank you, Amlan. This was a great session, and the thing which I want to take away from this is Raj Kiran's comments, which the sovereign AI does not mean isolation, and that's, I think, is the crux of it. And the conversation also talked quite a lot about how we can think about trade agreements to kind of fix this point of non-personal data. And I think that's a good segue to the next session that we have, which is looking at data trusts and non-personal data, and the role of AI within these and the role of AI within this framework. So we've got a great panel again. We've got sorry, one second. We've got Asta Kapoor, who is the co-founder of Apti Institute. Shweta Mohan Das, who is a researcher at the Center for Internet and Society. And we've got Amol Kulkarni, who is the Director of Research at CUTS International. And we have Anvesha Sen, who will be chairing the session. And welcome everyone. And sorry that we kind of went a little bit over time, but we hope that the answers, the question and answers can kind of help a little bit more, and we can probably just take a little bit more of your time for the session as well. Over to you, Anvesha.
Thank you, Shashi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us, for being here. Just to sort of provide a brief context on why this is a topic that we should be talking about much more than it is. While harms and illegalities and regulations concerning personal data use, whether for AI development or even generally, this is a topic that is quite regularly discussed. But when it comes to issues related to non-personal data, these are sort of overlooked generally. And for example, in India, we lack regulations when it comes to, say, data scraping for publicly available data, which is quite a big risk when it comes to AI development and using such publicly, for example, data available online for AI training. And so using such data without the required regulations, etc., not only poses possible copyright and IP violations, but also risks re-identification of individuals, along with a host of other concerns. So just to start off, I would like to go to Amol first. Amol, if you could talk a bit more about the privacy and consent implications of using non-personal data for training AI models, particularly in different sectors, and also what sort of privacy protections can be applied here in this sort of sector-specific framework. Over to you, Amol.
Thank you, Anvesha. Thank you. Just before I dive into the question, I just wanted to check if you can hear and see me clearly.
Yes.
Okay, great. And thank you, MediaNama, for inviting me on this important discussion. As you have said, this is quite important conversation, but often overlooked because of overwhelming conversations around personal data. But it was good to know that last few sessions, particularly the last one, also touched upon the issue of personal data. And when we sort of think about privacy implications, including consent, I think some of what you also touched upon in your opening remarks. But just before that, and notwithstanding a lot of confusion and ambiguity around the scope of what is non-personal data, how it is different from personal data, where are there clear boundaries? If we take a step back and sort of think about what could be those privacy and other implications, so we need to think about how non-personal data is generated. Broadly, as you know, it's basically anonymized personal data, which could be considered as non-personal data, and another set of data which was non-personal to begin with, soil data, climate data, and there could be several implications when we think about using these two and maybe different other kinds of non-personal data for AI development and AI training. For instance, we know that for AI training, there are sort of large amounts of data are required and sourced from different sources. There could be gives rise to mixed data sets or different varied non-personal data sets having personal data and a mix of non-personal data. And when sort of all these things are sort of merged together for training of AI, there is a high risk of re-identification and sort of identification of the person and individuals to whom the data relates to. I think that is one of the clear risk when, particularly when there are data sets which are sort of which originally belong to individuals and they have been anonymized and they sort of used as non-personal data. But I think also when we look at other non-personal data which were non-personal to begin with, there are a lot of concerns around using them. Sort of there could be sort of non-personal data sets which are uh, uh, through sort of created through public funded mechanisms like sort of census and sort of other such mechanisms, and there could be non-personal data which could be sort of created through government entities or other measures like say electricity consumption or say sort of road data or similar other data. So all these data, even if they are non-personal, they sort of link to and relate to groups of individuals and communities of individuals. I think that is where some of the risks also lies because sort of it's sort of difficult to identify one person whom these data relates to, but then if they can if usage or misuse of this data could adversely impact or target a particular community in a particular geography or particular type of sort of a group, then there are sort of risks of targeting, discrimination, ethical concerns about using the data. And then obviously you talked about consent implications, so who to take consent from. There have been some proposals in terms of how do we think about consent when it comes to sort of data belonging to groups and communities, but they are sort of perhaps yet to be operationalized at a large scale. And it's not only about when the data is trained. I think it's also about how the data is used when once the training happens. So for instance, there are several new examples of using non-personal data. Very recently, I think Airtel launched the AI spam detection tool, and it claims to use non-personal data, but sort of there is a risk that, for instance, a number is sort of marked as suspicious number. And if I have that number, if I sort of know the name of the person to whom that number belongs to, and I upload that name with a spam on some other platform, which sort of collects information about spam from publicly sort of marked data sets, then there is that higher risk of some genuine entities or genuine persons being identified as spamsters. This is just sort of one example because it's quite recent. Then there are examples in sort of financial sector also in terms of usage of non-personal data, alternate data, without necessarily taking consent from the persons to whom that data relate to, even if it's sort of data. But there is that a small distinction in alternate data, because alternate data like a mobile phone number, even if it or a photograph, even if it is in my phone, but that can belong to multiple people. An address can belong to multiple people, a photograph can belong to multiple people, and therefore there is that risk of there is that prevalence of using co-owned data or multi-party privacy, which sort of comes into picture when some of these data sets are used. And then how do we think about consent in that scenario is something that we need to still think about. So I'll just sort of maybe restrict my opening remarks to these two issues given your question, but obviously as we move further, we'll discuss about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. Actually, the next question is quite related to what you were saying. I'll go to Shweta for this. So like Amol mentioned, that when we talk about personal and non-personal data, and that the distinction between the two isn't always clear, and then hence results in the use of hybrid data sets for AI training. So Shweta, if you could sort of expand on that a bit and talk a bit about how such mixed data sets can be managed and how their privacy can be protected.
Thank you, Anvesha, and I think thank you, Amol, for adding a lot of context to I think what hybrid data sets are, what are the issues that can come with it. So yes, I think just before we talk about mixed data sets, I just wanted to spend a little bit time on non-personal data, particularly in India. As Amol mentioned about, say, government data or like data collected by government authorities, while we're asking the question about how non-personal data can be used for AI, I think we need to go back and see the quality of the data. So there've been a number of reports which say that the government data itself is of not good quality. Maybe the numbers are not correct. For example, for like birth and death registries, it's not accurate, it's not correct, or like there's a lot of issues even just with if you don't even hybrid the data or just talk about non-personal data itself. If you think that yes, that is the safest use of data, it's not even correct. So the results that can come from just non-personal data itself can be dangerous, say not dangerous, but maybe risky for using it for public policy, using this AI and just this non-personal data and making decisions based just on that. Again, on hybrid data as well, again, there's no definition of non-personal data. And again, even with the new version of the personal data protection bill, the earlier versions, I think, gave examples of what personal data could be, say, location, official identifiers. Well, that has been removed from this version. So now it is just like data that can be identifiable to a person, that is personal data. Again, it leaves a lot to interpretation. And what is not considered personal data is non-personal data. So it's very difficult to exactly know what is non-personal data, what is personal data. Again, for example, and the value of data changes as things go on. For example, like maybe 100 years ago, maybe IP address would not fall under personal data, but now it is extremely sensitive sensitive personal data. So I think in terms of hybrid data, I think that is the issue that comes, is you never know what data becomes personal, what becomes non-personal data. And again, when these two data sets are mixed, the likelihood of de-anonymization identification becomes easier. Again, because non-personal data is not regulated at all. So there's like maybe a larger quantity of non-personal data. And even though there's a little bit of personal data, if it's very particular to a region, say like anonymized hospital data and maybe like hospital records, if they're mixed together, and I think while we talk about how this data can be used for AI, maybe AI can also be used to de-anonymize. Maybe the power or the AI is powerful enough to go through all these data sets and figure out patterns and actually identify individuals. So I think that's another issue where like AI can be used the other way to de-anonymize people. And also the other hybrid data, that is the issue in terms of like, they can be mixed together and maybe identify a person, or maybe it lacks context, because again, non-personal data, your consent is not taken. You don't know where this data is being collected, how is this data being collected, and then it's been used with sensitive personal data. Like you don't know what the results are going to be used for. For example, if it's like I think the Airtel was a good example. Another example could be like your food delivery apps. If they decide like, okay, you're ordering these non-veg on like a festival day, maybe they can, without your consent or without your knowledge, put you into one category or profile you based on that without you knowing or having consent into like, okay, I want my food orders to be shared with the insurance company or shared with my employer. You never know who it's going to be shared with. I think another issue with non-personal data, again, hybrid data and sharing, is who these third parties are. You never know. Like it can be maybe the government, can be insurance company, can be employers. So again, that I think you feel the non-personal data is innocuous, it is benign, it might not, but you never know when it's combined with a lot of non-personal data is combined. You never know how these can be used to make decisions, and you never know when these decisions have been made against you based on these data. So I think the last question was in terms of like how to combat them or something. I think not how combat, but like ways of
ways to manage such mixed data and best practices basically.
Right. So I think best practices could be, even though the personal data protection does not act and there's no non-personal data protection framework, there still could be consent or choice while recording this data. So say if like the app says, okay, we're going to collect this data and share it sometime, maybe you should have a way to say that, okay, I don't want this data to be collected. I don't know what's happening with it. Maybe there should be like a choice. I think there should also be, maybe, if not, okay, consent is too much and takes too much time to like collect everything, but maybe notice at least. Or I think consent, I mean, I'm sure like we don't need consent maybe for weather data, but maybe we need consent for say traffic data or my Uber data or my transport data. Maybe I don't want to know that every night I'm traveling late at night and insurance thinks, okay, maybe you're doing something unsafe, or like that's the reason. So that is, in terms of like, there should be like some form of notice and consent, even though it's non-personal data, and some form of data security as well. I don't think non-personal data, since it is non-personal, should be like free for all. There should still be some form of data security, consent, if not consent, at least notice when non-personal data is being collected. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. So I think one more thing that I'm picking up from what you're saying is there maybe needs to be a sort of classification on what sort of non-personal data would need consent, what would need notice, and what you can freely collect, basically.
Right.
I think that, yeah. So thank you so much. We'll sort of move into the topic of open data and community data. So Astha, just to start off, if you could briefly explain what data trusts are and sort of delve into how they are governed in different geographies, different countries, and also how that compares with how it is governed in India.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Amol and Sweta, for framing the discussion so well. I was intrigued by the use of data trust in this conversation, as I always am when data trusts come up, because they have become a conceptual, I guess, placeholder for a lot of different things. So just to clarify that, I mean, in my mind, it's not data trust, but I think the explanation that's required is just, the idea of data stewards that as DPDP allows us to delegate consent. Is it possible to delegate to a responsible steward who is able to Shweta's point, manage some of those consent-based decisions and have a fiduciary responsibility to the individuals? So is it possible for us to pool our data rights in a meaningful governance framework and have that pool data be stewarded by a trusted intermediary that who can safeguard some of those, because as Sweta said, like, consent is not always feasible, and at the individual level it most certainly is not feasible. So is it possible for us to find governance frameworks that allow us to do that? And I've been very excited about this delegation situation in the DPDP, because I think that gives us a little bit of room to play around if we were creative. And we've seen some of these creative usage of, for instance, right to interoperability in GDPR being used to exercise collective rights. I think what has been clear by both what Amol and Sweta have said is that we are not in a position to negotiate at the individual level. We do need collective mechanisms and not data trusts, which I have still not defined, but certain kinds of data stewards do allow for that. Data trusts rely on trust law, and lawyers in the call are likely better suited to talk about this. But basically, it's an ability for us to pool assets in the way that people pool wealth or land and have trustees manage that land and have a fiduciary responsibility to the people who pool this asset. And so that is a concept that's being that has over the last 5 years been extended to data. I actually don't know a good example where trust law has been used to create these governance mechanisms. However, stewards, which is not in the form of trusts, but in the form of cooperatives, collaboratives, unions, do exist, where people are able to either pool their data or pool their data rights to exercise greater agency over how this data is being used or misused. So an example which unfortunately has collapsed because of, it was a drivers cooperative out of San Francisco and Sacramento called Driver's Seat, which a lot of people have talked about quite a bit, where it was a data cooperative. It had an app where workers could put in their data. They would aggregate that app, that data, give value back to the workers, sell that data to municipalities through a rigorous discussion with the workers. And then also over time, it was envisioned that they use that to negotiate with platforms. In the context of India, sadly, that didn't scale, and sustainability issues came up, but it at least gave us a conceptual understanding of what is possible. Similarly, in India, as we know, there was in the NPD report many years ago, 2021, also dabbled in the idea of community rights and data trust, though it never defined any of these things. But the idea was that again, people create these governance mechanisms to exercise rights. The unfortunate thing is that even in instances where people have tried to pool data, like I mentioned in the EU, in the Netherlands specifically, app workers tried to use the right to interoperability to port their app data, so from Ola and Uber, into a worker-owned data trust, but unfortunately were not able to structure that governance mechanism. My view is I think it needs to be much simpler, is that I think it needs to rely on existing human collectives. So whether I'm a big fan of the cooperative structure because they're already, they're already structured to pool labor and capital. So is it possible for us to also think about pooling data rights and have the board, which has a responsibility towards its members, is democratically governed, talk about that. In the context of NPD, we've been trying to do this with things like soil health. So we've been working with cooperatives both in India and elsewhere to see if soil health data, which is very clearly data that is non-personal, can be stewarded collectively through the cooperative structure, both to get better insights for the members on their soil health, because right now all of that data is fragmented, but also to see if it's possible to create greater accountability of government services and programs through that pooling. There are, again, there are smaller efforts that are happening globally around this. They're imperfect, but to me, that's the only way to do this at this point, because as both Amol and Sweta have said, and even the panelists before us, this is very tricky territory, right? We know that we're scraping enormous amounts of data. We actually don't know what rights we can exercise in those circumstances. We also know that the harms, as Sweta said, are so diverse and beyond the realm of imagination that for anybody to meaningfully today consent or not consent to something and expect impact is really problematic. This is something that we've been saying for a long time, is that I think that the data first governance is something that we need to reimagine. I think it needs to be much more focused on impact. So what kinds of harms that are being created? Is it discriminatory? Is it exclusionary? What are the harms that are created from data use? And lose focus on the data type itself, because we've lost that battle entirely. It's almost laughable for everybody who's been advocating for DPDP. It comes, in now, to the extent we actually don't know how we can meaningfully exercise our fundamental right to privacy in the format that the Act exists in. So my view is that as the rules come out and we move into much more sectoral implementations, whether it's in the context of health, whether it's in the context of the environment, we need to start thinking of much more use-based governance of data versus the data type-based governance that we've been quite stuck in for as long as we have, because we're seeing misuse of NPD, right? We're in the context of, for everyone who lives in Bangalore knows that, and going back to open data, flooding data is fairly open, right? It is possible to access this through BBMP portals if you know where to look, but also this data is being used by builders to manipulate land prices and housing prices, right? So if you have flooding prone region or where Kaveri water is not available or is available, that manipulates housing prices, which is a no-brainer. But you can also, to the point that Sweta made, actually start to ghettoize communities basis some of these non-personal data markers, which is happening. It's abundant, and we just don't know how to govern around that. And the last point in all of this is that this is everything that the government has been doing in terms of trying to the binary between personal and non-personal has been created largely to create opportunities to monetize data. That's something that we have seen, whether it was in the context of, the IDMO that was trying to figure this out, even before the elections, comments were made on monetization. Several states have considered this as well. So this artificial distinction between personal and non-personal actually opens up the doors to monetize data, or creates an opportunity to do that. And that to me is also a pretty scary possibility, because if if that starts to happen, we're moving away from governance at all into actually commodification, which the NPD framework facilitates. So how do we also address that meaningfully? And to me, as I started, I think that we need data stewards of different shape and forms to serve as a vehicle for us to exercise our rights. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Astha. That was really helpful. I think I'd like to delve a bit more into, this monetizing of data, and so essentially how, big tech more or less has a monopoly on all these so-called high-value data sets. And given that data is such a crucial part of AI training and development, there is this fear, and also it is sort of being realized that there is a monopoly being created in terms of which organizations are able to effectively, train, deploy, develop AI models. So Amol, I'd like to go back to you for this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how this can be overcome and what sort of practices and regulations need to be in place to ensure competition.
Thanks, thanks, Anish. I think it's quite broad question with several implications, but I think I'll just try to answer it. Before that, I think excellent perspective which was put by both Shweta and Astha, covering different points. But I think I'll just take some of the points which both of them made and try to also add a little bit more from me to answer your question. So, in terms of sort of there is data, particularly non-personal data, which is sort of being created and collected, and there are attempts like stewards, as Asta has pointed out, to sort of ensure a more democratic governance of the data. Obviously, some of these attempts have not made the desired level of success, but we have looked back to our own sort of original model of cooperatives, which has been successful to a large extent. And I think this also partly sort of begins to answer your question in terms of how do we think about creating competition in this whole data space. But they are just sort of, before I jump into the competition regulation and that kind of a discussion, when we think about cooperatives, obviously there have been a lot of success stories, but there have also been a lot of risks when it comes to monetizing the asset which is being created or the data in this particular case, and whether the structures or the hierarchies which are there or which are there in the traditional community settings, will they be replicated when it comes to making decisions about data and usage and governing this, which could lead to, again, discrimination and sort of decision making by only a subset of communities which are powerful within the communities to whom the sort of data belongs to. I think that is one of the very important risks that we are realizing. We have also been working with farm producer organizations and self-help groups, and this sort of is reflected time and again that structures and biases which are there in offline physical world would re-emerge in different shapes and sizes and forms when it comes to making decisions about the online world, including usage and governing of data and sort of benefiting from it. So just sort of keeping this aside, how do we make sure, or are there mechanisms to make sure greater competition, or given that a lot of investment is required in training artificial intelligence and sort of collecting data and sort of creating it in a structured format so that it is possible to sort of feed them into training sets, and sort of a lot of the AI sort of training manpower is sort of monopolized by the big techs of the world, as you have correctly said. And there have been the world is waking up to this. There have been realizations that this is a very important issue. And as a result of which, a lot of experiments are going on across the world to sort of rein in big tech we all know about the ex-ante competition frameworks, which are being experimented with in different jurisdictions, that in case you are sort of a significantly big sort of player in a particular digital sector, then you'll have to comply with some obligations beforehand. And there is no requirement to prove that you are abusing your dominant position. It's sort of the burden of proof lies on you, and you have to sort of make some sort of corrections and comply with some additional requirements. However, I think, and this is being experimented, or this has been proposed to be experimented in India as well. However, the jury is still out in other jurisdictions wherein this is being tried out, because there are a lot of unintended consequences when it comes to imposing ex-ante frameworks on these big tech frameworks, and subject to them to some conduct obligations. There could be unintended consequences in terms of access and quality for consumers, some cost implications, and sort of additional compliance burden on startups and other business users who depend on such big techs, and therefore it's still not clear in terms of whether the ex-ante framework is the way to go about. There have also been sort of attempts, particularly in other countries also, but also in the proposed non-personal data governance framework, the two reports which are out, to talk about sort of mandated data sharing and sort of creating a framework to ensure that at least metadata is available at low cost for everybody, and then whoever wants some raw data, it needs to be available at sort of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory pricing. So those were sort of attempts which were made in quite earnest, if I put it that way, despite the apprehension about commodification of data, as Asta had pointed out. But these were genuine attempts. However, I think there are risks also in some of these attempts, because the incentives then to within startup community to collect and create sort of niche products perhaps diminished by the possibility of mandatory data sharing. And also, while there is a pipe which is being created between sort of small startups and maybe domestic entities, just to sort of take some ideas from the previous panel, and to flow data from big players to smaller players, the same pipe can also sort of transfer data from smaller players to big players, and sort of the big players would again become a big. And we have seen sort of instances of killer acquisitions and sort of other actions within the data community or the digital community, wherein the potential competition is sort of just killed by buying. But in addition to that, I think there have been some genuine sector-specific data exchange and data sharing frameworks which are being experimented, particularly in other countries, wherein governments of in these countries are sort of nudging when incentivizing data exchanges, which is perhaps one of the ways to think about this. Also, I think the ex-post competition framework needs to be strengthened, which is being done as we speak, as sort of the conversation has shifted from the non-personal data framework a couple of years back to strengthening the competition law. We know that there has been sort of a merger review regime which has been put in place, particularly for digital economy. There are settlement and sort of similar norms which are in place, which sort of incentivize potential defaulters to sort of come and settle their cases. And also very recently, the Competition Commission of India has also created a framework wherein third parties can be sort of deployed to check whether the remedies which it has sort of given are actually being implemented and enforced or not. So I think some of these the intention behind some of these frameworks and actions is to ensure that any sort of untoward action in terms of adversely using your monopoly is, within the data ecosystem is sort of prevented and adequately sort of responded to. However, we are yet to see whether these actions would actually result into some benefits when it comes to breaking data silos, and maybe we'll also need to think about greater collaborations between the sectoral regulators, the competition regulators, and sort of other stakeholders in the ecosystem. And also keep experimenting with the frameworks which Asta had pointed out, like the sort of steward framework. But as I said, the incentives of some of these need to be worked out clearly for some of these to work. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. I think we'll delve a bit deeper into some of these questions during the audience Q&A. I see some questions regarding these topics. I'll go to Shweta now. So when we're talking about making non-personal data available or opening up training data sets, how do you do that in order to address issues such as bias, discrimination, and also developing, demographic specific solutions, etc. So how do you, create or open these data sets while also ensuring privacy? If you have, some practices or possible recommendations around the sort of using of non-personal data to address bias, discrimination, etc.
Right. Thank you, Anvesha. I think it's a really difficult, again, how we discussed earlier, that there's no framework for non-personal data. Is very difficult to say how best to use it to train AI systems. So before I think about, before I answer this question, I think just looking at the question on, say, I can give the example of, say, voice data. So for voice data, from my earlier research, we had worked on, say, voice interfaces in India, and we realized that I think 13 IITs had created like Indian language data in like different languages. And that was completely non-personal data because it was like each syllable recorded by a person. And so it is voice data, but it is not completely non-personal data because it's not related to a person. But then startups were still preferring user-generated data or like data from, say, big tech companies and purchasing it or getting it through competitions. And they were preferring that over this data because, again, it wasn't suited, or according to them, it wasn't human-like. It sounded very robotic. So they preferred this. So I think there's always a preference for personal data or non-personal data because, again, personal data has, again, with all the guidelines and consent, it still has a better analysis or better results it might give. So even though there was this completely safe non-personal data because it wasn't related to anyone, I mean, there were two people's voices, but that's all. But they were actually preferred for their chatbots to have user-generated data for that. So I think that is an issue in terms of like, before we ask that how it can be used, I think it makes sense that should it be used? And second is it feasible? Do people actually want non-personal data for this? Again, quality is another issue that will always be there in terms of non-personal data because, again, it's collected and there's less scrutiny over it, so it doesn't matter. It can be all the type of data. Some issues that come with non-personal data, I think, in healthcare is like, for example, if we think about the recent research we're doing on AI in healthcare, we talk about, say, for example, if we think that X-ray sheets, just the X-ray can be non-personal data, but sometimes what happens is doctors or the radiologists, they write the patient's name or they write something on the sheet. And when that has been used, it is personal data, but there's a lot of cleaning and annotation that needs to be done to make sure the data is completely safe, completely non-personal. So I think that's definitely there. So even when we ask how non-personal data can be used for it, maybe, again, government data, like climate data, like soil data can definitely be used, but it doesn't relate to a person at all, and maybe those can be used. But I think when it's regards to a person where I think a human being is being affected at the end, for example, it'd be wrong for me to say that, okay, we need to use, say, I don't know what non-personal photos would be, but say non-personal facial data, AI-generated face data for training facial recognition system. It's completely wrong. Well, there is no other solution. I mean, if there is facial recognition, you would need consent and all these to train these systems. So So I think that's a very different in terms of the use of what is the intended use of it. If it's, say, for example, non-personal data that is being used for, say, making decisions on insurance or finance, it's very difficult because there's no context. And if it's like a group of people in one area is getting affected by a few people, and like your rents are going up because of certain issues where you don't have a say in it. So it's very difficult to say that I would prefer secure consent, taken personal data to be used for this than just say non-personal data to be used. So I think if my answer doesn't, I know it doesn't answer directly your question, but my answer would be that consent taken, secure, regulated personal data be used for this than non-personal data, unless if it's like for climate or soil or something where human being doesn't get affected directly at the end. I mean, eventually maybe, but not directly at the receiving end of it. So I think that was.
Thank you, Shweta. Yeah. So maybe to talk a bit more about marginalized communities and the effect that the use of, open non-personal data can have, so-called non-personal data, which may also have personal repercussions. Maybe Astha, I'd like to come to you for this. What are your thoughts on, maybe expand a bit on the type of community data rights that either already do exist or should exist in order to protect communities from inadvertent repercussions or other such, results from, creating developing some of these AI use cases, and also maybe your thoughts on regulations that are needed in this space of, community data and open data, and cultural nuances that need to be taken into account.
Really big questions, Anvesha. I think that again, there's no simple answer, and there's also why we don't see any reasonable regulation on non-personal data globally. We also see no mention of community rights. It sort of like comes and goes, but we don't have any way of working this out. While I'm sure, and I know that a lot of jurisdictions are grappling with the same questions as we are. So one is that there's nothing to point to in basis my research. What I think that in terms of vulnerable and marginalized communities, I think that what we are, and like when the NPD report came out, and a lot of us were, I know Amol and I chatted about it a lot, which is like, what is a community? How do you think about lived experiences with regard to data? Everything is so complex. I'm in a Facebook community, but I'm also in my RWA community because they've got CCTVs. So, the complexities around communities are immense. And that's also meant why we've not been able to frame a reasonable rights framework around this. We do know that there are significant group harms, as has been discussed, and it has nothing to do with personal data. This relational data can be can be manipulated to target individuals. So I think that there is a lot of work that has been done around that, both in terms of how group data can harm individuals and how individual data can be extrapolated to harm groups. And I think that the dietary preferences, rents, so like I said, discrimination, exclusion, all of that. We see this in workplaces all the time, which is like productivity data is weaponized against workers. It doesn't need to be your productivity data, obviously, but it is weaponized. So in that context, as everybody's been saying, this is a very thorny issue with no good answers. And I think that the instruments that data protection legislations have given us in the form of notice and consent are clearly insufficient. And so even Sweta's ask of like use consented personal data versus non-personal data is it's valuable, but likely not possible anymore. Where I sound like doomsdayisk, but I think that I think we're well beyond those kinds of assessments, especially where, as we know, OpenAI is relying on contracts now with Condé Nast or Sage Publication to just supersede any kind of consent, right? So we don't even know where the rights frameworks come into place. In an ideal scenario, as I mentioned, we would have both the recognition, it doesn't need to be complex, but the fact that we do have community data rights, and it really just can be that. And governance mechanisms, as I mentioned, stewards of different shapes and forms, for health, for climate, for public interest. AI has obviously become a big thing, and there are a lot of people that, and I think there was a question also about public AI. There are opportunities to say, okay, fine, if this is in the interest of public, what does that mean? But then, of course, the complexities of who defines what public is also do come into play. But so my view is that one is just in the same way at the highest level is like you have a fundamental right to privacy, and that's given us a lot to chew on. I think that at that same level, with almost no explanation, just to find a way of saying we do have community data rights needs to be inserted somewhere, which is why even the ones that didn't agree on the data mandates of the NPD report, like I didn't, the idea that there was a recognition of community rights was quite encouraging for a lot of us. And I'm hoping that now with the DPDPA out of the way, we may be able to bring some of that conversation back to the table to see where that goes. The second part of it is, again, like I have been advocating for this for a long time, and this has been Aapti's work also over the last 5-6 years, is what are those models? How do we govern it? How do we test them? Because they don't exist, and they also need to happen while we're still making sense of what these community rights are. So I think that we do need to invest more in, and our work supports that it's valuable and it's necessary. The question on scale and all of that is something that needs to happen. And then I would say, finally, in terms of where this conversation goes, the other thing that I would very strongly advocate for is greater participation. So we know that data banks exist in the health sector. This is an enormous amount of data banks exist, right? That's how, and these data banks that existed for researchers, particularly to look at, to do science, have now obviously become huge repositories and are fobbing off requests from training models to say, can we come and train on your data? Now, this is sensitive data. This is data that has been collected in the name of and for the purpose of public research. So universities are under a lot of pressure now where a lot of these repositories lie. It is possible to create mechanisms of participation for that, so that people with lived experiences who may or may not be in that database, right, do have greater degrees of participation and decision making on how that data is used. We did some work on a mental health data repository to say, okay, fine, this is a data repository that has existed for the last 20 years. It has been one where researchers, pharmaceutical companies, everybody's been coming to do the research because repositories are absolutely essential for science. Now, we know that this is an imperfect thing because it has longitudinal data, it has data from different parts of the world. How do we create a lived experiences participation mechanism that allows people to at least co-govern the direction of that data, at least ask questions, demand accountability, demand transparency on data use from that lived experiences perspective? And I think a lot is happening on more participatory mechanisms when it comes to AI. I think that, like I said, like the conversation has moved so far beyond personal and non-personal and governance and non-governance that there are mechanisms now that are being saying, okay, can we do citizen assemblies? Can we make sure that we create ways to constantly put pressure on the direction of data use versus trying to do, split hairs on data type?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Asa. I think now we'll move on to audience question answers. I'll look at the Q&As in the chat first. We can sort of go through them. So the first one is, what will be the guardrails that will be deployed to monitor the fine line between NPD and its use in profiling, and whether India would go for an opt-in consent or opt-out consent? So I think we've quite deeply discussed that this is quite a vague sort of regulatory space wherein there aren't as many regulations, especially in terms of NPD. In terms of consent, maybe Shweta, if you would like to add anything there.
Right. Thank you, Nisha. Okay, just read the question again quickly, just on the So I think for non-personal data, maybe, again, it's a new consent framework. And again, I don't, so possibly maybe opt out in the sense that just for ease of like having consent fatigue and everything, maybe it's an opt out. But thing, but again, we can't say anything because there is no framework, there is no, there is no guidelines for this. So it's again just my opinion, and again it can keep changing as well. So for now, I think it makes sense, easier to opt out. But again, how it works with, say, digitally versus physically, how does it work with, say, different languages with people, like it's not always English, that's the only language that's there. So I think all these questions, it's a difficult question to answer, but if it was me, I would say opt out.
Thank you. So the next question is on the effect of non-personal data in relation to data sovereignty. Amol, I think we were talking a bit about that. If you would like to jump in.
Sure. So I think, yes, this is quite an interesting question, but obviously this is also dependent on how do you define what is data sovereignty and how do you sort of what is the intent for which you're using. For instance, I think if I recall correctly, the final report of the non-personal data framework talked about high value data sets, and it provided a list of high value data sets for job creation, for in agriculture sector and whatnot. And if you think that, okay, you can mandate data sharing for those objectives, and because those objectives are relevant for the state or development of the country, and that is how you define maybe data sovereignty. That is one way to look at it, but is that the best way to sort of foster data governance and non-personal data governance and sharing? I am not entirely convinced of, for several reasons, including the vagueness and ambiguity around the high value data set definition and also its linkage to data sovereignty. And sort of the mechanisms of data transfers and sort of incentives of the parties which are involved in this. Another way to think about data sovereignty, as we have thought in the personal data debates, is about data localization, and is there some sort of a data, some part of equity which should not go outside the country, or should something be retained? I remember the Reserve Bank of India had imposed restrictions on taking payments data outside of the country, and only for specific reasons. And even if it is taken out, it needs to be come back within 24 hours or so. So there have been some experiments around this, but I don't think that has also resulted into some sort of specific benefits which were intended by the payments sector by the Reserve Bank. The third way to think about this is sort of, as I think previous panel was also talking about, was India's data for use of India. And in terms of, because if we try to transpose data from outside for use in Indian conditions, that might not necessarily be the best way to solve domestic problems, and therefore the data sets which are sort of intended to serve Indian public needs to be trained on Indian data, and that is sort of the way to go about it. But I think that is one of the ways to look about to look into things, but I think we need to develop those capacities and those nuances and have those protections around data collection and usage. And sort of, as I think, as Shweta also pointed out initially, that a lot of those data sets are not reliable, and therefore there is a risks of sort of incorrect answers and sort of hallucinations, which is now feature and not a bug, and sort of inadequate governance for involved. So I think these 3-4 ways to think about data sovereignty, each of them have their own sort of risks and perhaps benefits, and therefore there's a need to maybe do some more experiments and have some sort of maybe sandboxes to think about how best to go ahead with to deal with some of these problems and situations.
Thank you. We also have Sashti Brata who's raised their hand. So maybe you can ask your question and then I'll go back to the chat question answers.
Hi, you've been unmuted. You can speak. Okay. Maybe you can type the question in the Q&A if you can, Sasti Prata. Maybe you can move on to the next questions.
Yeah, sure. So the next question, another big question for the panelists. Is it idealistic to lobby for the implementation of the theory of contextual integrity of data use, which is the use of non-personal data being restricted by the context in which the data is made public? Can tech or AI tools be plugged in to automate context identification, and could this run on a blockchain? I will leave this open.
Maybe I can go first because we are just releasing a report in a day or two in which we have tried to use the contextual integrity framework in terms of multi-party privacy, as I was talking about, and sort of data sharing when the data is used by or perhaps owned by different people. The problem here is that even if you think about the context and the purpose for which the data used in that context, how would you enforce this in a real life scenario and situation? What are the guardrails around not using it in other context and sort of for other purposes? I know you have talked about use of tech and AI tools, but I think this is a very tempting kind of a solution, but also loaded with risks because this can also go wrong. I would be more than happy to sort of share a report and maybe have a more detailed discussion with you and other interested stakeholders on particularly this issue. I'm sorry to jump in, but
no, just to agree with you, Amol, I think that these contextual integrity does make a lot of sense theoretically, but again, like once it's out in the open, rolling it back and making sure that we're able to I guess uphold that is quite complex. And again, would be happy to be educated in this case of examples, and I'm looking forward to your report in that context. But again, we don't know where this has been done meaningfully, especially if data is being made, and I think the word was public. So I think that it is possible if you're doing much more closed sharing of data. So if you're having again, like I said, a pool, and again, some of this has been contemplated where you create data pools between the private sector to share data in a trusted manner, but it's closed, and in which case it is possible. But again, examples are few and far between.
Thank you. Okay, so the next one is on open sourcing AI and whether it's a solution to monopolization, considering the unfair advantage of big tech on proprietary data. I think we did discuss this quite a bit, and open sourcing AI in itself is quite a complex topic right now, especially with open data sets. How much openness is necessary? How much openness is safe? Those are some questions that need to be dealt with. If any of the panelists would like to add on to this question, please feel free, or then otherwise we can jump to the next one.
Only one line, that how much open are actually the open data sets? So are they actually open? That's the question.
And also to add to that one more line, which is that how do you prevent commercial capture of open infrastructure, which again is its own can of worms, but also worth highlighting.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, this is, I think, a question for Amol. What do you think is the impact of the recent merger between Amazon and Anthropic AI with regards to compliance and data collection with network effects?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question, and it's very recent development. I think the whole order is not yet out. to the best of my understanding. But I think this again sort of points us to the emerging frameworks. And I think what happened here was, given the size of acquisition was below the threshold, therefore they didn't require full investigation by the competition authority. But then that itself is a question that, are these quantitative thresholds good enough for initiating investigations, or should you look at the bigger picture? What should be the threshold, or what should be the frameworks for sort of going into and asking the questions about competition? I think we'll need to just wait and watch in terms of how this will play out, but this will be impacting the AI space quite a bit as we move forward.
Thank you. The last question here is, a key challenge in the AI context is ensuring the meaningful exercise of data subject rights within LLMs trained on vast data sets. Do you see data governance framework models exercising community data rights within the context of the DPDPA for sector-specific AI applications built using highly curated data sets? I think that is for Astha.
Hey, I can jump in also. Hi, Bilal. So, I mean, I think that it is, again, theoretically possible, and we are seeing a push to much smaller models, which I think might be a way to do this. I think that it is possible to curate, as I was mentioning, even if, so I don't see that in the context of DPDPA at the moment, and maybe that's just me. But I think that definitely in the context of more participatory data governance, which is not necessarily encoded in the Act, I do think it's possible. And I think that we are seeing this, as I mentioned, particularly in the context of health, where the governance of data is being curated outside the ambit of the law, but definitely as a mechanism to unlock some of that accountability and transparency that we've been pushing for. So short answer, yes, highly curated data sets, it is possible, but I wouldn't, but I think that we would have to work quite hard to see how we create more participatory mechanisms around that. I do not think that it happens in the ambit of DPDPA as I understand it, but again, would love to hear if anyone else has a conversation.
Yes, Shashi, would you like to say something?
Yes, I have a question as well. I think this is a question which I had asked participants and the speakers in another session as well, which kind of talks about this tension between data minimization principles and AI itself, right? And I think this panel is more suited to also talk about this as well. We know that a lot of discrimination with AI models happens because of biased data sets that we have. And to improve fairness and make sure that there's no discrimination, you need more data. And therefore, it kind of there's a lot of push and pull again about this tension about whether we should allow for more data to be pushed in the algorithm so it can correct itself. And it's necessary as well, but because in a lot of use cases, particularly in the social sector, where we're seeing AI being deployed for a lot of things like subsidies, etc. Again, we need a lot more data from communities to kind of clear the bias over there and kind of add more context as well, and kind of think of a more think of a more justice point of view and kind of using AI for that purpose as well, where AI systems can also give different weightages for different types of communities as well. So wanted to check with you and how privacy also would play a role in this in some way, where you are actually asking for more data from people over here, right? So just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on this. Maybe with them we can close the session as well.
Me? Okay. Again, tough question, Shashi, but I'll hazard a response, which is that one of the big things that we've been thinking about is the value of data and how do we distribute that much more meaningfully, and how do we make sure that data is not just extractive, but also a mechanism for people, like I said, to ensure accountability and also derive their own value out of it, right? And I think in my mind, people are at least like in the context of, like I said, like women's agricultural cooperatives, we spend a lot of time talking about the value of data. And then when it makes sense that there is indeed value to data and that it can be maneuvered and manipulated for their benefit and not just for extracting higher interest rates from them, for instance, in the context of loans, women are more willing to contribute to data. But the thing is that we don't do a good enough job to communicate that data value. And that's also been the hardest part of our work. As we've been trying to organize people around data, communicating value of data is very, very hard. And so that to me is a gap in. So yes, theoretically, I think that your question in terms of can we do it? Yes. Will people contribute more? I believe so. But I think that there's a long tail of demonstrating value in a trusted and meaningful way, and which we're not able to do. So yeah.
I wanted to also add to that as well. In terms of figuring out meaningful compensation for a lot of these very, very specialized data sets which people create over there. Are there ways that we can think about, giving back to these communities who are generating these sets? Are there different types of licensing models that we could think of when it comes to data sets which are being created? Again, from a perspective of kind of being a lot more fairer to the people who are actually creating these data sets as well.
And please don't let me but I think that there are models, obviously, and everybody's been tracking all the data labeling stuff that's been happening and has become that intersection of creating women's work in their homes as well as data sets in different languages, and so it unlocks a lot of I guess development goals that we're all chasing. I think that that's one way. These are definitely models I haven't fully examined. Obviously, we've looked at data work from the labor perspective, but not from the data perspective. So, value for reuse, etc. I am a bit, so that's on the labeling side, but which is always like a distant, it's almost like a task you do, which is disembodied and it's not about you and it's not for you, etc., etc. Where data is much more embodied, where it is about your soil health or your flooding or whatever else, which also, by the way, in many, many instances, particularly in Southeast Asia, women are starting to do, which is that, they're taking photos of deforestation, they're tracking, like I said, flooding, soil health and things like that, and are now using it to hold local governments accountable on climate action. So in that context, I think value is much more beyond monetary, and I think as it should be, which is to really push for a certain kind of purpose or cause or something that animates the community, and those are co-governed and co-decided. The other value of data that we've seen, and maybe this moves away from your question a little bit, is also negotiating on privacy, which again, women's groups do quite a lot of, which is that collectivizing data to ensure that they're able to reveal what they want and conceal what they want, which is again a big part of, in my view, that incentive to participate in the creation of data sets.
Okay. Thank you so much. anyone else who has thoughts about this?
Yeah, sadly, I don't have thoughts on about the value creation or like the good side of it, but only thing I can say is the only option should be that it should not be used to harm people. So like it's the opposite side where like you shouldn't be disincentivized or like basically you shouldn't be harmed, you shouldn't be discriminated because you decided to give your data or because you decided not to give your data. So I think it was also discussed in the panel as well. So again, before I think about harm, what I value, I think about like harm. We shouldn't do the opposite of it. Like we shouldn't harm people. So more than value, I think I only worry about the harms.
Just one small thing which I want to add, which is that I think it might be useful to learn from our experiences and community's experiences from the non-data world, particularly when it comes to sort of rolling out of infrastructure projects and people are required to give away their land and sort of other assets with the hope to get some compensation. Because I think there have been somewhat similar discussions therein that people come together to take collective decisions about whether or not to sort of give away their land or their assets and how much to sort of charge for and what is the compensation, what are the terms and conditions. But there have been a lot of risks and sort of there is sort of bargaining asymmetry, as we all know, in terms of the voices from the ground not actually being heard and not interpreted in the manner which they are intended to. I fear, I think this is what I was also trying to say when we were thinking about other models of governance, is that I fear that there are a lot of intermediaries which are trying to sort of capture this space by saying that, okay, they can talk on behalf of and for communities and persons and people, while they might not necessarily have the right incentives in place to do so or understand to do so. They are just intermediaries and not necessarily sort of representatives of people, and that is where the risks lies. Because you can sort of empower communities to talk for their rights and sort of take their own decisions, but that will take time, as Asa has pointed out, but we do not have time because there are developmental goals to be met. And if there is a need to monetize this, there is somebody who needs to come in between, but then there are sort of incentive disalignment, which sort of robs communities of their true rights and benefits. So I'll just go stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amol.
I think with that, we could close the discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists. And sorry about the long questions, but lots to discuss, lots to unpack. It's definitely clear that there's a lot of things more that need to be discussed, even advocated for. There's an increasing requirement for better privacy protections, better governance, even community-led governance. So I think there were a lot of important points highlighted. Thank you to Shashi and Nikhil and the MediaNama team for having us. A very crucial discussion. Have a great evening, everyone else. I think that's the end of PrivacyNama this year.
Thank you, Anvesha. And thank you, Amol. Thank you, Shweta. And thank you, Asta. Thank you taking so much time to actually delve into a lot of these questions that a lot of the audience have put forward. And a big thank you to the audience, because we always feel one of the biggest strengths of MediaNama's events is our audience who ask a lot of questions. And that's what we try to encourage as well. And we want people to ask a lot of questions and also kind of see if we can get a few answers, maybe. But yeah, the questions themselves are more interesting sometimes. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you.